Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about What If Deku Had a Darker Destiny Part 1. If you guys enjoy this What If and want to see Part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Literacy from 𝐬𝐵. So let's start the video. Kyoshi muttered a slight oath as she wrapped the gray shawl she had hastily taken upon waking tightly as a cold breeze blew past her. Shivering where icy fingers touched naked flesh, Kyoshi moved in a circle and wished that she had not been woken so early in the morning. A girl as young as she, even if her station in the palace was that of a servant, needed sleep. Her prettiness would wither if ever she missed an hour, and she knew that her face was the only thing she had in her possession that can take her away from the line of work she had to do now. But the poundings on the door had awoken her in the wee hours of the morning, where not even the sun's head had peeked from the gray sky. Kyoshi was positively certain that she'd turn into some battered hag, now that she had missed her sleep. Immediately, she placed a hand on her face. Smooth. It was still soft and smooth, albeit a little cold. Her dreams of snatching a lordling was still possible, hopefully. Still, the fear of some sort of scarring trembled within the confines of Kyoshi's mind. She spun, eyes glaring at the large set of double doors that were shut tightly in front of her, and hoped that her eyes bored into the occupants of the room inside, making them feel the cold she felt now. Kyoshi had no idea why she was suddenly called to the Matriarch's chambers, only that the two servant boys had told her to stay outside and keep watch, to wait until the double doors open. They left Kyoshi in the cold then, where even the bright torches of the halls did little to keep her warm. Stupid royals, Kyoshi said in her head. To say those words in the halls, even if it looked as if it was deserted, would cause her pretty face all bloodied up and stuck in a pike for the vultures to pick on. Kyoshi shivered. That was a fate she wanted to avoid the most. But these royals were preposterous in their requests. Outright stupid. If it weren't for the gold they liked to throw around like spit, Kyoshi would have slapped their faces with a wooden ladle. But they had gold, and Kyoshi knew better than to defy orders. Gold or no, Kyoshi had no idea why this order had been issued to her. Biting her lip, she pondered her situation. For a maid of low ranking such as herself, the matriarch had no use of her save to carry out small tasks. To wait outside of the matriarch's chambers, however, was not a small task. Was it a grand joke then to the matriarch? A sort of ploy to cater to her amusement? But even court fools wouldn't do this kind of thing, and the matriarch was a kind of woman who seemingly didn't find humor in anything that was meant for humor. Brows knit further in concentration, Kyoshi lost track of her circuit and suddenly found herself on one of the palace's large windows. There, cold air broke her trance and brought a spark of anger inside her. She turned and began to head where she saw the two servant boys had disappeared to. The only possible reason as to why she was here at this hour had to be because the boys saw this as a very grand prank. Kyoshi bristled at the thought. She did not know them that well, but she did know that boys at that age were mischievous little imps who liked to prey on helpless young and beautiful maidens like herself. Those snotty kids were just jealous of her face, that's all, and had made a scheme so that when morning came and the doors to the matriarch's chambers opened, she'd see a servant pale as moonlight with expectant eyes like that of a debt collector. Kyoshi knew if that happened it was bound to set some cogs into motion, and send her to her fate as either a relegated servant or as an outcast in the palace. Kyoshi pictured their faces as she reached the doors of the matriarch. They were probably leering at her, hands on their mouths to contain helpless giggles at the face of their ingenuity. Well, Kyoshi had something to counter that. Just they wait and see. Determined, Kyoshi passed the doors, only to be stopped a few paces when she heard the doors suddenly opened. Kyoshi turned around and curtsied at whoever she saw in an instant. It was almost a reflex now, this bowing. Of course, every servant needed to know how to bow and to ingrain it in their heads. The sound of cloth shoes shuffling on the marble floor alerted Kyoshi that someone was moving towards her. She kept her head bowed, body tense for a reprimand, until she saw the hem of a deep red gown swish in front of her. Well, I'm now starting to doubt the matriarch's intention for choosing you, girl. Puzzled, Kyoshi could only process the words inside her head and let assumptions take over them. The tone of the voice that said those words sounded wry, so she could only guess it was an insult concealed within words of a different meaning. Indignation rose within her at the thought of this. After a few moments of tense silence, the hem of the gown moved away from Kyoshi's limited sight, and she almost sighed. But then she spun, the gray world a blur around her, until her vision came to rest on a gaunt-faced woman with wisps of gray hair protruding from the rest of her hair. Her eyes were sharp and commanding, and her thin lips were twisted into that of a half-smile. Her face was familiar, and after a few moments, she remembered who the face, the body, and the hand that gripped her arms tightly belonged to. Mistress Kotsu could pass for a noble, Kyoshi had always thought. There was something in the way that she carried herself that made her look as if she was a class above the rest, above Kyoshi herself. Even now, Kyoshi felt like she needed to bow to the head servant, to show her respect, but she held herself aback from committing the deed. Mistress Kotsu was a servant after all, cut from the same cloth as she. Blinking, Kyoshi gathered her spinning thoughts and formed one question. What do you mean by that, mistress? A sigh and then a muttered curse followed before Kyoshi saw the woman's eyes roll to the side in exasperation. Really, she might be the head servant, but her demeanor was far from being servile. Then, the gaunt-faced woman released her hold on Kyoshi. Come, follow me, she said as she motioned for Kyoshi to enter. There, Kyoshi stilled, her body frozen as if covered in ice. Mistress Kotsu beckoned once again, but Kyoshi merely let her voice enter her without any analysis. She hadn't seen it coming, but since it felt as if she had stared towards the nothingness for too long, Kyoshi suddenly felt bony hands wrap themselves around her arms. Startled, she tried to pull it back, but the hand that held her didn't budge even the slightest. Are you daft, girl? Mistress Kotsu hissed. There is no time to be like that now that the matriarch is waiting. We must make haste. Without waiting for Kyoshi's reply, the head servant pulled her into the matriarch's chamber, ushering her into a dimly lit corridor as the doors closed silently behind her. Kyoshi's eyes darted here and there, examining the walls that confined her, and that led her to a portal filled with light just a short distance away. She heard a sigh, and soon, the head servant was ahead of her, beckoning her to follow. Be grateful to the matriarch for the honor you are about to receive, girl, Mistress Kotsu said as they moved in a hurried pace. In the shadows, Kyoshi couldn't see well, but she thought she saw worry in the gaunt face of the woman. That was odd. Kotsu was rarely worried. But never mind that old maid, Kyoshi said to herself. Somehow, hearing those words made Kyoshi's lips twitched into a small smile. She hoped the woman didn't see. Honor, she said from the matriarch herself. Kyoshi felt giddy at the thought, and relief washed over her in violent waves. So the servant boys weren't lying then. Good for them. Kyoshi might just reward them when she received whatever honor the matriarch would give her. Still, Kyoshi couldn't help but wonder. Why would she be given something? A servant of little ranking. Kyoshi may not have received education aside from reading her letter and counting numbers. But something didn't quite add up to this current situation. They were closer now to the opening where warm light shone, and she could hear something shrill there in the distance. Kyoshi put that out of her mind and focused more on Kotsu's words. The matriarch wanted her, that was all. Kyoshi was so deep in thought, however, that when they passed the opening and warm light flooded her, she failed to notice the scent of blood that filled the room and only did when she met the bloody visage of the matriarch sitting across her. A scream was ready to leave Kyoshi's lips when Kotsu placed a hand on her mouth. Her eyes were hard as she mouthed her the words to be silent. Kyoshi nodded, confused, but returned her gaze to the bloodied matriarch. She was alive, thank the gods, and she was smiling as she regarded the two of them. To Kyoshi, however, the smile did not reach her eyes, and it painted a look of horror into her as the light of the flickering candles made her look as if she came out of a bloodbath. Perhaps she did, Kiyoshi surmised, noticing blood covering half of her white silk nightgown. Sweat covered her forehead, and her dark green hair fell limply on her shoulders. Pale, Kiyoshi noticed. The light may have concealed it at first, but this close told her that the matriarch was deathly pale. Mistress Kotsu gave a curtsy, startling Kiyoshi into following her. Aghast, Kiyoshi could only gawk at herself as shame washed over her. "I have brought the servant you have requested, Your Great Eminence." The matriarch nodded, seemingly satisfied, then caught Kiyoshi's gaze and pointed a finger to the bed beside her. A bed that was, to Kiyoshi's surprise, covered with more blood than she had seen in her entire lifetime. And there, wonders upon wonders, on the center of the bed, writhed a small mass of blood-covered flesh. Breath left Kiyoshi as she studied the child, and astonishment soon followed as she realized what the babe on the bed meant. "The matriarch's firstborn," she whispered, awestruck. For a moment, Kiyoshi's eyes were glued to the babe. The babe was a he, and Kiyoshi noted the child's sleeping face, his chubby hands closing and opening, and wondered why he hadn't been washed and clothed yet. She turned around, facing the head servant instead of the matriarch, and asked, in a voice she perceived to be humble and inquiring, "Why hasn't the babe been taken care of, Mistress Kotsu?" "The day is cold, the prince could get sick." A chuckle came from the matriarch, and Kiyoshi turned, surprised to see mirth in the monarch's eyes as she regarded the child. Confused, Kiyoshi could only move her mouth to ask, but no sound came forth. "I doubt that child could get sick. His blood is strong after all," the matriarch said softly, albeit Kiyoshi could see that her eyes, when looking at the babe, held no warmth or mirth. Only an emptiness that made Kiyoshi shiver. She had brothers and sisters in the small village where she came from. All 10 of them. Kiyoshi was the third eldest, and had helped her mother give birth to her brothers and sisters each time. In all those times, Kiyoshi would always see her mother's eyes wet with joy at the sight of her crying child. But it was different from the matriarch. Kiyoshi could tell that there was no love between the babe and the monarch. It was clear as the rising day. A question started to form in her head, and she was about to voice it out when a soft fabric was placed on her hands. Startled, she stared at the cloth, then to the one that gave them. Mistress Kotsu's eyes were sharp and commanding. "Clean the babe, girl. Don't just gawk at it." With a start, Kiyoshi made her way towards the large bed. She saw that there was a basin of water situated on a drawer beside the bed, and she dipped the cloth there to soak. Slowly, with great care, she took the child from bloody part of the bed and placed him close to her where she began her work. No sooner than she placed the wet cloth on the prince's head did the babe cry in a piercing note. Kiyoshi wasn't fazed, however, as she wiped the still drying blood away from the child. Infants always cried, and there wasn't much helping it with this one as well. Her brothers and sisters were like that. Infuriating as it may be, Kiyoshi felt herself move with confidence as she did her work, and soon, the child was clean before her, his pink skin soft and smooth. He had stopped crying a while ago, and was now invested into sucking his small fingers into his small mouth. Kiyoshi giggled seeing the sight. "I guess royalty can act like that as well." A satisfied sound came from Kotsu, and Kiyoshi found herself watching the woman's appreciative stare. Kotsu turned to the matriarch. "Your Great Eminence, she is perfect. Forgive me if I had doubted your earlier decision," she said with a bow. The matriarch laughed and patted Kotsu's shoulder with a bloody hand. "It's understandable, Kotsu, but it is all right now, don't you think?" But it was not. Not for Kiyoshi, at least. What were they talking about her being perfect? Did it have some connection to what Kotsu had said earlier about the matriarch giving her something? Kiyoshi's eyes fell to the babe, whose eyes were beginning to flutter close. A soundless yawn escaped the child. Kiyoshi had a feeling that this child was connected to something the matriarch had yet to give her. "Do you have siblings, Kiyoshi?" The voice of the matriarch suddenly broke Kiyoshi from her reverie. and the servant nodded as an answer. 9 of them, Your Great Eminence. The matriarch's eyes flashed appreciation, much like what she saw in the face of the head servant, and she nodded. That is great to know. Silence, and Kyoshi was left smothering in them as she regarded the matriarch and the head servant. None of them seemed to want to say something. But Kyoshi was not content to exchange glances with a ruler of a nation and a ruler of the servants in the palace. She was afraid that her prettiness would go haggard if she dragged this long enough. She knew there was something at play here, and she had a suspicion that she knew what it was. Her gaze went to the matriarch's firstborn, now sleeping. She considered, for a moment, before she wrapped her arms around the babe and slowly raised him so that his head rested on Kyoshi's chest. There wasn't even a sound of protest coming from the prince. Kyoshi then gazed at the queen and tried her hardest to suppress a gasp of surprise that wanted to escape her the moment she saw her eyes blaze with approval. It seemed this was the honor Kotsu had said earlier, the reason why she had been awoken so early in the morning, the reason why she had to wait in the cold and worry about her pretty face. They were planning to make her into an old hag. Fighting the urge to scream at the matriarch's stupidity, Kyoshi held on to the child, gripping him so tightly that he began to stir in her hold. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing deep green irises, before it closed once again. A thought bloomed in her mind, a plan that made her smile inside her head. Your Great Eminence, I'm afraid I can't raise this child. I have no money to afford his necessities and infants need a lot. Oh, don't worry about that now, dear Kyoshi. Rest assured, I plan to give you the needs you so desperately need to raise the child and more. Those words made Kyoshi lose her composure for a split second. She tried to battle away the smile that formed in her face, tried to put on her mask of servitude. But it had been far too late, and a bright, eager smile slashed at her face. The matriarch smiled as well, amusement clear in her eyes. Kotsu, however, was not pleased by the looks of her face. To Kyoshi, it looked like a gathering of heavy thunder clouds ready to pour. She didn't care, however. She had her way out now. Very well, Your Great Eminence. I will take care of the child, she said, her voice filled with confidence. She smiled at the sleeping babe in her hands, the key to her salvation. Suddenly, asked the matriarch in a surprised tone, What shall be the name of the prince, Your Great Eminence? You tell me, Kyoshi. You'll be the one raising him, after all, and as for him being a prince, well, let's just say that time will tell. I've no desire to let bastards sitting on the throne, after all. Kyoshi sucked in a breath as pity rose within her for the child. So that was why the matriarch had no love for this child. He was someone not desired by Nor. But it didn't matter to Kyoshi now. Soon, she would have what she had wanted and more. Right now, she just needed a name to give to the matriarch's firstborn. Her mind spun, and her mouth moved to form the words. Izuku, Kyoshi breathed. His name is Izuku. Very well then, the matriarch said. She clapped her hands, a clear sound in the room. I, Isuku Midoriya, matriarch of the 13 Isles, keeper of the crest of 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, and mistress of the storm deep, hereby grant you, Kyoshi of 𝗧𝗏𝗧𝗏, stewardship of the barony of Balame, where you will be raised to the status of baroness in the service of the kingdom. Do you accept this, Baroness Kyoshi of Balame? Kyoshi felt giddy with happiness, but her lips moved and her eyes met the matriarch's stare. In a voice choking with delight, she said a word so clear, so bright, so certain, that she knew there was no other fate for her than greatness. Yes, Kyoshi disliked royalty. There was no explanation to her dislike. It was as if the feeling was just there whenever she looked at them, or whenever she would get close to them to serve them their wines and their plates of silver filled with food. Unease would writhe within her like snakes, and she would feel as if she wanted to claw at them, to tear them apart. It was an urge so strong that Kyoshi would wonder how she came to be like this. She guessed it began when she first knew of royalty in her small village at the age of 6. Back then, she had been the youngest of her family's 3 children. And 𝐭 had all the privileges that the youngest child had. Being carefree, being loved, and given all the things her parents' money could afford. 𝐭 had felt like she owned everything in her tiny world, that is, until invaders came charging and broke the spell that caused her delusions. The sight of an elegant palanquin that entered into their village green had caused a great commotion among the village folk who had rarely seen such things, 𝐭 included. Rumors had spread to her ears that there was a prince inside it, looking for a bride. To 𝐭, it sounded like fairy tales his siblings and his parents would always tell her before going to sleep, but excitement coursed through her as she realized it was happening, that it was real. A fairy tale that had come true. Her parents had been ecstatic, for both of them were farmers who grew rice in the fields and harvested them when it was time. The money they get from their harvests was small, 𝐭 knew that at a young age, but they had been happy to know of that rumor, and had risked everything into sending the eldest of the three, 𝐭's sister, Kanno, to the village green, and there, to meet the so-called prince. 𝐭's sister was beautiful, and they had hoped that her charms would ensnare this prince inside his palanquin. Then, their life would change. When Kanno set out to the village green, 𝐭 and the other had waved her goodbye, but 𝐭 had been a child wrapped with curiosity at that time. Without a thought, she followed Kanno into the place where the prince had been situated. There, a crowd had gathered and 𝐭 thought that it was the whole village came to witness this prince. Music filled her being upon arrival, and her eyes saw a multitude of colors as dancers, streamers, and clothes of different colors weaved through the gray vista of her village. It was a celebration, an exuberant festival that rivaled the celebration the village did during the harvest moon's appearance. She saw Kanno be greeted by warm welcomes from the village elders, and there, she followed her as she was taken to the center of the village green, where a multitude of women of Kanno's age had gathered. The press of the crowd had nearly squashed 𝐭's small frame, but she fought against it, and then, she saw. Memory of the prince had been clear as a cloudless sky on that day. Swathed in clothes that she could only discern as colorful and expensive, he had laughed in merriment as he danced with the girls before him. His dark hair was rich and long, tied to a braid where it would wave and move whenever his dance would take a sharp turn, and his feet were nimble, capable of moving so fast that 𝐭 had a hard time following his steps. Fascinated, she had shouted the word "prince" in time with the people, and watched as he finished another circuit, until 𝐭 saw her sister appear, and the prince's mirthful gaze fell towards her. The prince stopped his dance, and a great hush descended on the people gathered at the village green as he raised his hand for silence. Of the girl that had been his partner before Kanno's appearance, 𝐭 saw had settled on the distance with the other girls, carrying with her a face filled with venom. 𝐭 barely giggled at the woman's jealousy. Kanno was pretty, and the woman's face was merely nail clippings to her sister's beauty. Avid eyes, including those of 𝐭's, watched as the prince came close to Kanno. 𝐭's sister gave a curtsy to the prince, a shy smile on her beautiful face. The breath left 𝐭's body when he saw the prince bend down and asked Kanno's hand, but it soon became part of a great cheer when she saw Kanno's answer. She placed her hands on his. The women who had gathered around the prince earlier made disgusted faces at sight and left, but 𝐭 forgot about them as she was swept in a wave of glee as the villagers all flocked the couple together. It was a fast union, but 𝐭 was delighted that her sister was about to marry a prince. Their life wouldn't be hard now. She could have everything she wanted when they had the prince. That night a celebration was held in honor of the new couple. 𝐭's home was filled with people as they joined the celebration, bringing food with them to contribute to the party. Her parents were teary-eyed as they embraced her sister and greeted her soon-to-be husband, and old wives had jeered at them, telling them jokes about not forgetting them when they hit the high life. Her parents told them they would not, but 𝐭 knew she would forget them. They were dull people, after all, sticklers and old farts who compared her to Kanno time after time. They didn't deserve to be remembered. The party had carried on well into the night, And by the time the moon was high up in the sky, and the last of the food had been consumed, the couple had retired to the room of her parents, and the people had filed out in groups. Kiyoshi felt tired as she settled alongside the sleeping form of her parents and other siblings. Tired as she was, she merely stared at the starry sky and wondered what his sister and the prince were up to at this hour. The light from her parents' room hadn't been extinguished yet, and it outlined the door frame in a warm, golden glow. There in the silence of the deep night, she contemplated to take a peek at the room. Then, Kiyoshi heard a sound. It was faint, but she knew it came from the room. Kiyoshi stilled her breath and forced her ears to listen beyond the beating of her heart. A creak, and then it was followed by a wet noise, something that reminded Kiyoshi of slap her mother had given to Kano when she had done something wrong. There came another sound as well, a moan, but it disappeared as rapidly as it appeared. For a moment, Kiyoshi remained in her position, but then thought better of it, rose, and slowly moved towards the room her sister and the prince occupied. More of the wet sounds filled her ears as she neared, as well as the sound of moans and creaking. There was a small gap in the bamboo walls that separated the room from the rest of the house. Kiyoshi went towards it and placed her eyes on that small gap where golden light seeped. The light had blinded her momentarily, but when her eyes adjusted to the brightness, there were no words to what she saw on that gap on the wall. There, her sister lay naked with the prince on top her, twisted in an awkward position where her legs were spread wide to accommodate the prince's something. Kiyoshi almost gasped when she realized that something was similar to what the boys had between their legs, only that it was erect, and that no skin covered the tip, and that it was far larger than what the boys had. It pierced her sister again and again, and each time it disappeared within her sister's body. Kano would convulse in pairs and would begin to open her mouth, but the prince, sweat-covered and breathless, would smile a wicked smile and placed a hand on Kano's mouth, silencing her. Kiyoshi watched, confusion heavy on her mind, as the prince made quick and strong thrusts into her sister, making Kano create strained noises in her throat and making her breasts bounce. Tears were beginning to form in her sister's eyes, and a look of horror filled them. Pinned to the floor, Kiyoshi could only watch as the body of the prince shuddered, and in one last push, he bent towards her sister, capturing Kano's mouth with his own. Her sister shivered, her hands weakly pushing the prince away. Something white and glistening oozed out from the place where the prince buried his thing. It made a line towards the bed, where it disappeared within the fold of the blanket. Kiyoshi seemed to have escaped a storm that had ravaged within her as she found her breath. She took a mouthful of air, surprised that she had forgotten to take a breath for a moment, before she focused once again on the room. The prince pulled his something out from her sister. It glistened with the white liquid that oozes out from her sister, and a tint of red covered it as well. A satisfied smile on his face as he regarded her sister's form. Kiyoshi was gripped in anger, however, rippling through her in waves. How dare he smiles at her sister's pitiful state. She prepared to move, but as she began to rise, something bright flashed on the prince's hand and rested on her sister's throat. Kiyoshi couldn't believe the red that came out of her sister, nor could she fathom why she hadn't started moving. If she had moved during that time, she would have saved her sister from death. But her feet were stuck to the floor as if she had taken roots. She merely watched as life ebbed away from her sister's eyes, just like the blood that left her body and stained the sheets a dark red. The prince chuckled and stood, gathered the clothes around him, and left the room where Kano's body laid through the window, into the darkness of the night. There was a moment of silence, of the night deepening, before Kiyoshi's scream sundered the dreams of her future. Kiyoshi blinked away the memories that had flocked around her. Izuku was asleep in her arms as the coach rumbled past green vistas of trees and forests. They were heading towards Kiyoshi's land, their new home. Kiyoshi thought about the memory that had replayed itself on her mind a while ago, and she gave a small laugh. Baroness Kiyoshi of Balame was something that her 6-year-old self would have hated. But the murder of Kano had happened a long time ago, where she had changed just in time, and just enough to follow orders. Orders such as raising the bastard son of the matriarch of the 13 Isles. Kyoshi did not believe in fate, but she thought it as a cruel joke of the world to let her raise a royal child from infancy to manhood. What would have happened if she had the mind of herself 12 years ago today? Well, she would have thrown this child away for sure. Izuku stirred from her arms and began crying, as if he sensed the thought Kyoshi had and acted on it in distress. The once maid chuckled and cooed at Izuku to sleep once again. Things change, she still hated royalty, but this child had been thrown out, exiled from the matriarch's court and affections. He was no different from her if she squinted away the differences, alone, seeking something that would make him happy. "You seem to know your way with babies, girl," a voice said across her. Kyoshi nodded at the gaunt-faced head servant that accompanied them to their new home. "Of course," Kyoshi replied, her voice filled with confidence with a bit of arrogance. "I raised 7 little brothers and sisters after all." 𝐭𝐻𝑒 nodded. "That you did." There were no more words to be exchanged with the head servant in Kyoshi's case, unless of course she asked 𝐭𝐻𝑒 why she had accompanied them to this land called Balame, but Kyoshi had a feeling that she knew the exact reason why. Such knowledge, however, even in suspicion, made Kyoshi shiver in anger. A trip to the sea towards Kyoshi's new barony was a clear sign that she was to be sent into foreign territory, one outside of the 13 Isles. Kyoshi had never set foot in the Vasslands in her life. She had heard stories, yes, of the place, but they were just stories, and she doubted the stories carried a hint of truth about the Vasslands. For all she knew of it, Kyoshi knew just its name and the barony she is to rule. It was clear as day as to why 𝐭𝐻𝑒 was with her, and that is to guide her in overseeing her estate. Does she think I'm nothing but some sort of child as well, needing to be taken care of? Kyoshi could only hope that the head servant did not. It felt as if she had received a slap on the face, just knowing that 𝐭𝐻𝑒 was with her, still looming above her. Wasn't Kyoshi a baroness now? That meant she outranked the thin woman by a score. But 𝐭𝐻𝑒 still looked at her, as if she was incompetent, as if she was nothing more but a middling maid. "Do you know how to run a household, Baroness?" Without thinking, Kyoshi snapped her attention to 𝐭𝐻𝑒, eyes hard, and replied, "Of course I know how to see to the affair of a home, head servant. My skills have been honed to that." 𝐭𝐻𝑒 nodded, but her eyes were hard as steel. It was only then that Kyoshi realized that the head servant had addressed her in the title she was given with. Kyoshi was unable to comprehend what had happened in those short moments where they exchanged words. Dark eyes regarded her, and Kyoshi could wither from the stare, and although it did not look remotely baleful, she still felt as if she had been judged. "Would that you were of noble words when you said those words, girl. Then I would have believed and left you," said 𝐭𝐻𝑒 when the silence stretched long. Dimly aware of her surroundings, Kyoshi's mind barely registered that they had left the forest, and hand now entered fields rife with farmers and golden crops. Kyoshi disregarded this information. They were near, and that was that, and focused her attention to 𝐭𝐻𝑒. In her arms, Izuku made a restless noise. "What do you mean by that?" Caution entered her voice. The woman was up to something, and she knew it. "Oh, nothing really." 𝐭𝐻𝑒 shrugged, her eyes never leaving the new baroness. "If you were a noblewoman from birth, then you would have been taught on how to manage an estate." Kyoshi started to open her mouth, to fire back a reply to silence the head servant, but 𝐭𝐻𝑒's words cleared her thoughts away. A long ring echoed in her ears, and her being reverberated with fury and shame. "Sadly, you are a servant born into poverty. You know next to nothing about running a barony than you do governing it. You may know how to serve lords and keep a house running orderly, girl, but a noble's work is not that simple." Kyoshi could only stare at 𝐭𝐻𝑒 as the carriage rocked. Even the result of an uneven road could break her concentration on the head servant. Anger blazed within her, warming her hands, her body, but she couldn't quite put a grasp into what she could do to counter the gaunt woman's words. Kyoshi's grip tightened on the now stirring Izuku. She looked down, surprised to see deep green eyes watching her with calm. The babe seemed to know what Kiyoshi had been ignoring these past few days. Shuddering, Kiyoshi tightened her arms around Izuku, noting the child's warmth. There was nothing but the truth inside Kotsu's words. Kiyoshi knew that deep inside her, when she had heard Matriarch's words of power and riches, that she would be incapable of such a task, not about raising the babe, but of becoming a baroness and ruling a barony. For years she had hated the nobility, and when she had become a servant of the matriarch and her keep, she only had dreams of obtaining gold from a nobleman she could spin lies to. She had no knowledge of how to rule, nor had she taken up the initiative to study it. A servant did not need to learn such things, and a wife only needed to please her husband. But things were different than what she had anticipated, and, blinded by the matriarch's words, she had plunged head first into foreign territory. Ruling a barony did not require a pretty face, only the mind of a noble. Kotsu's face split into a knowing smile. You realize it now, don't you, girl? How helpless you are in politics and statecraft. No words could come to Kiyoshi, and to her horror, she hung her head in shame. It's true, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was pitiful, and she knew it. A calloused hand touched her cheek. Kiyoshi almost gasped at the sensation. That is why I am here, girl. I will help you, Kotsu said suddenly, her words terribly soft. Although it held no warmth in it, it carried with it reassurance. The tone of it shocked Kiyoshi more than the hand the head servant had placed on her. She looked up, unable to resist seeing the face of Kotsu, to see the truth in those dark eyes of hers. Much to her wonder, it did, only it wasn't a light, it was a blazing fire. Kiyoshi's throat was awfully dry. Despite what she heard from the woman, Kiyoshi couldn't quite understand why the headmistress would help her. They held no fondness for each other, and Kotsu had always been an aloof leader of the servants, helping only when she needed to. The gaunt-faced woman mostly kept to herself, overseeing things in the shadows. Kiyoshi could barely remember it, but on the day of her arrival to the matriarch's palace, Kotsu had come to her while she had been putting things in her chamber, gave her a cursory look, and led her to the palace's great halls where she had instructed Kiyoshi to polish the decorations until it shone. She licked her dry lips, then whispered a question. Why? Laughter bubbled out from Kotsu. To Kiyoshi, it sounded like glass cracking. Why to help you, of course. Stupid girl, do you really think you can manage the life of a baroness when you can't even command me, a servant below your rank, to be silent? You'd be eaten alive by the folk you're about to rule, and that's not good for the child. Yes. A shiver ran through Kiyoshi, and she raised her head. I suppose you are right, she said through gritted teeth. Well, there was her salvation then, in the form of a dark-eyed, gaunt-faced head of the servants. An unlikely one. But Kiyoshi knew she didn't have other choices. Kotsu's eyes seemed to sparkle. Great, she clapped her hands. But there is one thing that you must promise me, Baroness. And what is that? Replied Kiyoshi, her eyes narrowing. That you will follow everything that I say. Understand? Kiyoshi regarded the head servant for a moment, before breaking her focus and redirecting it to the window beside her. A great building of gray stone rose on top of a green hill. Her eyes widened, and a thrill ran through her. Yes, she said, oddly remembering that time in the matriarch's room. She had set her confirmation there as well. Yes, I will follow your orders. Kotsu smiled, so simple an act, and yet it filled Kiyoshi with promise. Very well, she said. Let us begin. It was night when Kiyoshi had reached the keep of Balame. Bright lights from lamps shone above the road that led upwards to the keep's gate, where, from her window on the carriage, bonfires blazed around the large archway manned by dark forms of soldiers. The keep seemed to glow in the night as they neared, as if the sun was nestled inside its walls, but Kiyoshi knew it came from the fires inside, and scolded herself for thinking of foolish things. To become a successful baroness, you have to be practical, She repeated the words the head servant, Kotsu, had said during the remains of their trip. Kiyoshi held on to that piece of advice as the carriage stopped in front of the large gate. The door opened, and Kotsu rose and exited the carriage first. Nobles are sticklers to propriety, and so will their servants, the head servant's voice echoed in her head as she made her way out. A hand rose to help her in her descent. It was Kotsu's. At first, Kiyoshi merely stared at it, frozen in her place at the steps of the carriage. But a quick, hard look from the head servant and a sudden jerk from Izuku forced her to take a step and to clutch at the helping hand meant for her. Kotsu's grip was tight, but Kiyoshi rivaled it as well. "Do not forget your lessons now, girl," Kotsu whispered as they drew near to the guards. "A noble of this kingdom should have their wits about, quick and sharp." Kiyoshi only gulped her affirmation. "Good evening, good sirs," Kotsu greeted the soldiers. With a shock, Kiyoshi realized that these soldiers were her knights, sworn to protect her and her land. She felt giddy all of a sudden. She felt as if she wanted to laugh and scream in happiness at this tiny knowledge. Nobody had cared for her since leaving her home, but now she had knights to keep her company. A squeeze from Kotsu broke the spell of her reveries as she noticed the woman procure something in her hands. With a start, she saw that it was the letter the matriarch had penned herself and had signed, bearing the royal seal of the 13 Isles and the matriarch's own seal of her decree to raise Kiyoshi from that of a servant to a baroness. Kiyoshi was sure she had put it in one of her traveling bags earlier in the trip. But now the head servant was giving to one of the knights, who read the words aloud for all to hear. The knight lowered the parchment and handed it back to Kotsu with reverence. Then he kneeled, his armor clinking as he did. "Welcome, Baroness, to keep Balame," the knight said through a muffled voice. Kotsu merely nodded, and Kiyoshi stared with wonder at the knight. "Well," Kotsu said, voice becoming expectant. Her eyes were not on the knight, but rested on the large gate that barred them from the inside of the keep. A great confection of wood and steel stood in the way of the road. The gate had not moved yet. "I'm afraid the Baroness would freeze to death by just standing here, no?" The knight suddenly stood and nodded. He placed both hands on his helmet and raised them, revealing a face not younger than Kiyoshi's own. The knight turned and called out with a booming voice towards the tower next to the gate, to open them so that the new Baroness might enter. There was silence. Kiyoshi was afraid that the knights of the keep did a trick on them. But before her anxiety took root, she felt the rumble of the earth and the sound of metal chains straining against stone. Izuku began to cry. But his wail was lost as Kiyoshi saw the gate open. The two large doors plated with steel spikes going inwards. Warm light spilled forth from the open gate, as if the light Kiyoshi had seen earlier inside the keep had been pooling, only for it to be released. A puff of warm air drifted towards her, carrying with it the smell of food and other things she could not name. Excitement coursed through her. It was open. The gates to her new home. There was no stopping her now, and all her worry about it not being real had evaporated into nothingness inside her heart. The knight turned, a welcoming smile on his face. Kiyoshi wondered if she'd grow used to being looked like that, with reverence, with respect. But as she stared and wondered, she noticed that the knight did not look at her, but at Kotsu, who eyed the keep with bright eyes. Her mind went to work, connecting one thing to another, and a gasp was ripped from her as understanding dawned. She made a move to make the knight know of her presence, of her title. But the knight beat her to it, extending his hands and clasping the hand of another. Only it wasn't Kiyoshi's hand that the knight gripped, but the head servant's. A strangled voice made its way to her throat, just as Kotsu made a sound of surprise. "My lady," the knight's voice was deep and rich as he said those words. "You must be tired from your long journey from the sea. Please, enter your keep." Kiyoshi's mouth moved, but no sound could come from her. Laughter filled the silence she could not banish, and it came from Kotsu, who shook her head at the confused knight. She pulled her hands away from him and directed his to Kiyoshi's own, cold, smooth hands wrapped around her sweaty one. "That is the new Baroness, Sir Knight. Not I." The knight's eyes flew wide open, and an astonished light filled them, only to be replaced by sudden alarm and urgency. He lowered his head and spoke. "Forgive me, my lady. This was an error on my part as a knight. Please, if you see it fit, bestow upon me a punishment." Surprised, Kiyoshi could only stare at the knight. But at a gentle nudge from Kotsu sent her thoughts tumbling inside her. There was no need to punish the knight, it had been but a simple mistake. All the same, a wave of envy flooded Kiyoshi as she made her words of pardon. Her thoughts were on Kotsu when they were escorted back to their carriage, of how the woman's simple gray dress had fooled the knight into thinking that the head servant was the Baroness. Their carriage rumbled past them, but the thoughts inside Kiyoshi's head lingered here and there. Finally, when the carriage stopped in a brightly lit courtyard, and they had stepped out of it again, Kiyoshi stared at Kotsu and understood. The woman moved with certainty, with a grace that she, a former servant, could not emulate. It was no surprise to Kiyoshi if some mistook her for a noble instead of her. Indeed, Kiyoshi was no match. In terms of how they looked, Kiyoshi doubted that she looked as regal as the head servant. Even her dress of fiery red, woven with faux gold, could not give a look of nobility the other had. Kiyoshi hung her head in shame, but at the same time her resolve hardened as she promised to make her position clear. Ahead of her, the doors that led inside the keep were opened, revealing bright lights inside. She moved first towards the doors, hoping that she looked regal as a royal. It was a hard task, since Izuku had not stopped his wailing cry, and she was afraid she'd be dismissed by the people in clothes of cream and white that stood on the doors as a beggar asking for shelter and food. She held her confidence, however, or the tatters of it, with a trembling hand inside her mind. Behind her, she could hear Kotsu's voice as she relayed an order to the coachman. She reached the alcove where the doors were located and stood just outside of the threshold, peering into the large room just beyond the doors. Kiyoshi didn't know why, but she was suddenly frozen as she regarded the large space just beyond. Somehow, she knew she was unprepared for this kind of life, only that she had been looking forward to it, like when she had looked forward to escape her tiny village and the memories with it. Queasiness settled over her as she saw the two servants at the door bowed to her. Gulping down her dread, she turned and saw Kotsu regard her with sharp eyes. She seemed to tell her something with just a stare, and Kiyoshi knew what that was. "Enter. Now," she seemed to say. Compelled by the unspoke words in her eyes, Kiyoshi though little of the dread and moved, the light warming her body as she entered. A great hall opened to her vision as she took the first steps inside. Torches bolted on the walls provided lighting as her eyes gazed at the enormity of the room. Windows high and arching gave her a clear view of the night sky. Below her, where her sandaled feet touched, the floor seemed to be made of glass instead of wood, for it shined under the light of the fires. There were doors and two sets of stairs to her right and left that led deeper into the keep, and in front of her, just a few paces away, stood two large high-backed chairs carved with intricate figures of roses and thorny vines. A small figure of a woman hobbled beside the thrones, her gray hair tied to a neat bun. Her eyes were dark with age as they rested on Kiyoshi. It reminded her of Kotsu's own. "Welcome to Keep Balame, my lady," the old woman said as she made her way towards Kiyoshi in slow motions. Wood thudded as her cane struck the floor again and again. The sound made Kiyoshi nervous. It was as if she was waiting for judgment. When the woman reached her, Kiyoshi was at a loss for words. But the old woman merely shifted her cane so that she leaned on her while she thrust her hands out. "May I?" she said, eyes gleaming. Confused, Kiyoshi only stared at the old woman's bony hands. But a quick glance at where her eyes gazed at told Kiyoshi that she wanted Izuku. Izuku, who had been crying nonstop. Izuku, whose tears had run down from his face and had dampened her gown. She must have tuned him out from her hearing, for there was no way the child could be in that state recently. Snot ran from his nose to his mouth, and he waved chubby hands about, as if he wanted to snatch Kiyoshi's attention. Izuku had, of course, only it was too late. She gave the old woman an apologetic smile and handed the child to her gently. "The young lord is such a crybaby," the old woman said, but her eyes were glowing with warmth as she cooed at Izuku. "Such a shame to see your chubby face with tears." No. But of course, the young lord wouldn't be crying if the mistress had just seen to him instead of gawking at the keep. Surprise could barely describe the feeling that gripped Kiyoshi's heart as she heard those words. The old woman's eyes were cold now, sharp and piercing. "My name is Selina, my lady, and I am the caretaker of this keep." Kiyoshi felt she had to do something to counter the old woman's words. She had been seen to Izuku since the day the matriarch had given him to her to raise. The countless days in preparation for her departure had also been countless days caring for Izuku, who seemed to always cry at the most opportune moment possible. This Selina had no right to tell her that she was careless. All the same, she found her voice had left her, and all Kiyoshi could do, as the new Baroness of Balame, was nod at the old woman's words. She felt herself choking on something, only that she hadn't eaten anything since the beginning of their trip. She forced herself to do something, to expel that lump in her throat, to banish the dryness that coated her mouth. Finally, she did, only that the words that came out was a pitiful croak. My name is Kiyoshi. The matriarch has appointed me as Balame's new overseer." Selina kissed Izuku's small head as she rocked him to sleep in her arms. "There's no need to introduce yourself, my lady. We know you have come. You must be famished from such a long trip. Come." "Please," Kiyoshi managed to say. "Let us wait for someone first before going." She needed Kotsu now more than ever. The old woman before her was not just some senile hag, but someone dangerous, one that could unravel Kiyoshi's facade and expose her as a sniveling servant that she once was. It didn't matter to her anymore that she admitted Kotsu's help was important. Much to her horror, she just needed the woman to snap her in place. Selina casted a furtive glance at the doors where Kiyoshi came. "Is this person important, my lady?" Despite her nerves creating havoc inside her mind, Kiyoshi managed a small smile. She shook her head. "No. Just a friend. She's the head servant of the Shining Palace." "Is that so?" There was it again. Kiyoshi swore she saw the old woman's eyes turn from warm to cold and calculating, and this time, there was a hint of a judgment being casted on her as she studied Kiyoshi. Gulping away her fears, Kiyoshi stared back, although it took all her power not to fall to the ground. Selina moved and returned Izuku into Kiyoshi's arms, eyes closed in sleep, and peered at the corridor. "If she's the head servant of the Shining Palace, my lady, then you outrank her by a league. I see no reason why you must wait for her," she muttered. Then understanding came to her eyes. "Unless, of course, you are bound to the head servant. In which case, it would be prudent to wait that, my lady." This time, Kiyoshi's dread remained, undaunted no matter how many gulps of dry air she took to her throat. Shock ran through her as she realized that Selina knew Kiyoshi's dependence on Kotsu. How it came to be was a mystery to her, but it was insignificant to what she faced now. Selina's face was shadowed, and repulsion glimmered inside her eyes. Kiyoshi, surprised by such a hostile look, took a step back. Kotsu's words haunted her. It made a chaos inside her mind. But none of her teachings on the trip earlier seemed to ease the clamminess of Kiyoshi's hands, or the way how her body slightly shivered with fear. Once again, Kiyoshi was powerless to do anything, even to fight back against a keep's caretaker that was once an old and low-ranking woman. Selina was no nobility, but all the same, she commanded an air of authority around herself, cloaking her. Kiyoshi took another step back, her mind struggling to comprehend the situation. Words would betray her. She knew that. As well as her voice, Kiyoshi couldn't make a proper and curt reply, even if she wanted to in the face of this hag. The thought of even giving a reply made Kiyoshi's forehead bead with sweat. There was nothing she could do now that could change Selina's expression. "What seems to be the matter, my lady?" Kotsu's voice seemed oddly heroic to Kiyoshi's ears. She turned around, her heart soaring at the sight of the gaunt-faced woman standing beside her, and met her steely gaze before her eyes moved towards Selina. "My apologies for making the lady wait," she said as she bowed. Selina inclined her head and waved her hands. "Nonsense. There is no need for apologies. She is, of course, this keeps lady. I am merely a caretaker, there is no need to make such a fuss." She chuckled. A lively sound. One that made Kiyoshi sick to the pit of her stomach. "I was simply being curious, that is all. In fact, it wasn't my place to question my lady's intention at all. The lady could have stopped any inquiries. But it seems my mouth got the best of me and made the words without my thinking. Oh, silly me." Kotsu narrowed her eyes, then fixed them on Kiyoshi. "So it would seem." Disappointment was clear in those depths. Selina clapped her hands, bringing Kiyoshi's attention back into the current world. "It is late, my lady, and the head servant has arrived. The young lord might be asleep now, but I'm sure he's as famished as you two are. Please, come this way." They followed Selina into an arched entrance where the aroma of food wafted out, where she and Izuku were seated in a long table laden with dishes. Kiyoshi didn't find the food much as she ate. Instead, she focused more on the bubbling Izuku, who seemed to have found a stem of celery amusing as he waved it to and fro. He made several keening noises, clearly delighted to have held the vegetable in his small hands. And from the corner of Kiyoshi's eyes, she saw Selina smile at the child. That was good. At least the old woman's focus was on Izuku. Sighing, Kiyoshi brought a spoonful of cooled porridge to Izuku. She motioned for Izuku to open his mouth, which the child did. But even with that, H still managed to make a mess of the food as he sputtered some out. Smiling, Kiyoshi wiped the food away from his lips and chin and brought another to him. It took a couple of spills and some porridge splattering on Kiyoshi's dress. But, blessedly, Izuku's appetite was sated, and the child had began crying to be put to sleep. Kiyoshi chuckled and tucked him in her arms, rocking him back and forth, humming to him a little song that she had always sang to her siblings when she had been caring for them. Kiyoshi turned around, surprised to see that Selina had disappeared from the table, and that only Kotsu remained, looking at her through unreadable dark eyes. "You have much to learn," Kotsu mumbled as she downed her glass of wine, courtesy of the staff who have opened one of Balfame's most prized products. "You'll have to be a proper lady by the time the young lord grows and matures. Understand?" Determination flooded Kiyoshi, and the memory of her earlier encounter with Selina came to her unbidden. Unknowingly, the old woman had set a flame inside Kiyoshi's being, a flame that Kiyoshi wanted to nurture. She returned Kotsu's stare with one of her own hard ones, hoping that the determination that filled her would show in her eyes. "Yes," Kiyoshi said, a bit surprised to hear her voice actually carrying a bit of hardness to it. "Very well," Kotsu said, smiling. "We shall start tomorrow." "The young lord is such a precious child, is he not?" whispered a servant girl to another as they dusted the decorations mounted on the walls of the hall. Izuku watched, holding his breath for fear of being discovered, as he listened to their exchange. The other servant giggled. "Of course. Didn't you see him the other day when he was out playing with the servants' children? Goodness me, I have never seen him so happy." The other nodded. Most Eastern nobles would rather spend time with their peers. But the young lord isn't like that. He gives this keep such a calming atmosphere. Izuku smiled upon hearing that, his heart fluttering with gratitude. He was happy to hear of what they thought of him, and it seemed that his mission to make everyone in their keep comfortable was a success. There was nothing more satisfying to Izuku when he sees a smile on everyone's faces. Now seeing the two servants chatter delightfully gave Izuku hope that things would be different now in the keep than what it had been. Content to see what had happened, Izuku moved quietly away from his hiding place behind a marble column supporting a bust of some unknown lord, and began muttering to himself that Master 𝗏𝗏, his tutor in academic matters, had enough patience with him today because Izuku had missed morning lessons just to snoop around the keep's halls. Dread filled his being at the memory of an angry Master 𝗏𝗏. Gods, Izuku quivered at the thought of spending another hour and a half solving equations. A fitting punishment to those who had invoked the ire of Master 𝗏𝗏. But in this case, Izuku had a reason to skip morning lessons, even though it may sound silly to other people. As Izuku took a step away from the two servants, hoping that he was small enough to avoid detection, he heard another bout of laughter come from the two. Pleasure filled him upon hearing, but it suddenly turned into a coldness that Izuku couldn't quite explain as he heard the words the servants uttered next. Unlike his mother, don't you think? Lady of the keep she may be, and mother of the young lord, but she couldn't hide the dirt that she came from. Ha! I can practically smell the servant in her, with the way she addresses that old hag Selena like some superior. Izuku felt a lump forming at the back of his throat, and knew that it was disappointment and shame and anger all joined together. This was one of the things he had wanted to avoid, had wanted to eradicate, but all the same knowledge about his mother remained like a stain to the otherwise prim memories of the keep's inhabitants, and it had always reminded Izuku of how his mother was perceived by them. He closed his eyes as he calmed himself, breathing in and out, until the lump in his throat had dispersed, until the feelings that came with it disappeared. When Izuku opened them again, he was surprised to see the two servants regard him with surprised stares. One of them had her mouth opened, but before she could say or do anything, Izuku ran away from them and made his way to his room where Master 𝗏𝗏 waited. Well, if it isn't the forgetful young lord, Master 𝗏𝗏 started, but Izuku ran past him and flopped on his bed. He dived under the sheets, gathering soft pillows and fluffy blankets around himself as muttered under his breath why his mother had to be picked on and insulted. It didn't matter even if it happened without her knowing. That was still a mean thing to do to Izuku's mother, to their mistress. Izuku had done everything he could do to make everyone in the keep forget what his mother's background was, but to no avail it seems. The people seem intent to remember that one flaw the Baroness of Balame had, and discard the other great things she had done to her barony. You heard them again, didn't you? Said Master 𝗏𝗏, his voice laden with concern. Izuku stopped sniffling and looked up to see his teacher's face and nodded. Yes, he replied weakly. Why can't they forget about it? A sigh came from Master 𝗏𝗏 as his craggy face crumpled in what Izuku could tell was sadness and shame. May I sit with you, my lord? He said while patting a small corner on Izuku's bed. He nodded, and a soft smile replaced the old man's face as he sat down beside him. Your mother, the Baroness of Balame, is a fine lady, Master 𝗏𝗏 started, patting Izuku's blanket-covered head. Izuku began to say something in agreement, but Master 𝗏𝗏 motioned for silence as he continued his sentence, his eyes telling Izuku to listen. But she is also a lady born not from nobility, but was raised to that position. Tell me, my lord Izuku, why do the people worship the nobility? Blinking, Izuku recalled his past lessons, of how the Matriarch of the Shining Isles had marched her armies upon this land and had taken it under her power, and how the people had been saved by the almost never-ending raids of the nomadic warriors of the East because of the Matriarch's actions. The people of this land had seen it as a gift from heaven, of the Matriarch being the savior of their homes and fields and lives. And because of that, they had worshipped the nobles that came from the Shining Isles. Although it was written history, Izuku couldn't quite grasp the fact that the people of Balame could worship the nobles. It sounded silly even as he recalled them, and for his mother to be ridiculed, even as she was a noble from the Shining Isles, was mystifying. Izuku's brows furrowed as he struggled to find an answer. The people were exultant of their salvation, and loved the nobility of the Shining Isles for it. But the Baroness of Balame was not a recipient of that same fondness. Izuku slumped his head on a pillow embroidered with rabbits and blue jays, his head starting to ache from thinking too much. I'm sorry, Master 𝗏𝗏, Izuku whispered. "I can't seem to find an answer. Other than the people worshipping the nobles of the Shining Isles is a bit silly to me." "That's understandable," Master 𝗧𝗏 replied in a placating manner. His hand stroked Izuku's head as his eyes took on a distant look, drawing in Izuku, who had made it his hobby to determine what was going on inside his teacher's mind. A rueful smile appeared on Master 𝗧𝗏's face, making him look more ancient than he already is. He turned, and his eyes were now clearer as they bore into Izuku. "But your answer is correct, my lord. That people are silly. Sometimes they envy those that rise in life, and wish to stain their reputations and blacken their names. Your mother had a clear flaw that they could claw upon to bring her down to the eyes of the many, but she is strong. Struggling, but strong." Sniffling, Izuku nodded at the words his teacher had said, a warmth seeping inside him. His mother was strong. Master 𝗧𝗏 had said it, had acknowledged it, and Izuku wouldn't bring that acknowledgement into doubt by distressing over it. He gave his teacher a bright smile and stood on the bed, his earlier work coming undone as pillows fell to rest on the bed and THW floor. He had promised himself he would see everyone smiling in this keep, and he wasn't joking about it. "You're right, Master 𝗧𝗏," he said brightly, jumping off his bed. The ancient teacher chuckled as he stood up and clutched at Izuku's shoulders before he could run off into somewhere. Izuku turned around, regarding Master 𝗧𝗏 with an innocent smile as he asked what Master 𝗧𝗏 was doing. The wizened man smiled. "Why, to make you strong, too, my young lord. You need to fight for your mother as well, my lord. And I specifically remember someone who missed morning lesson just to eavesdrop on idle chatter in the halls." Now it was Izuku's time to chuckle at Master 𝗧𝗏, whose eyes suddenly gleamed with eager knowledge. He tried to take a step back, but remembered the hands that held him bound. Master 𝗧𝗏, it is already high morning. Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃 would be waiting for me at the training field." Izuku fumbled for words in his mind, words that could excuse him of Master 𝗧𝗏's ever-looming presence. Today we'll be learning to wield the bow and arrow. Archery." A sinister smile was plastered on Master 𝗧𝗏's face as he led Izuku into a desk laden with stacks of parchment. Gently, he seated Izuku on a high-backed chair that was tall enough that his feet did not reach the floor and handed him an inkwell and a quill. The ancient man pointed at the stack of parchment. "Now, if you would, my lord. There are equations that needed to be answered, history that needs to be read, and languages that needs to be memorized. I'm sure an hour and a half wouldn't be too much for Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃." Izuku gripped the quill in his hands and began writing, holding back a grumble of protest. Master 𝗧𝗏 watched his progress with a satisfied and smug smile, and Izuku regretted ever coming to his room. "Steady now," Master 𝗧𝗏 intoned, a hand raised in warning. "To solve this problem, one must think with a clear mind." An hour and a half later, after wrestling with numbers and words, Izuku waved a sheepish goodbye to Master 𝗧𝗏 as he made his way towards the training grounds. His ancient teacher waved back, a look of triumph on his face, and he called out to Izuku not to be late once again, not finding any moment to spare to answer the old man's words. Izuku merely bobbed his head in acknowledgement. Time was of the essence, and it was particularly his fault if he showed up late on Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃's lesson. If only he just went on with the day's schedules instead of listening here and there to bits of conversations, he could have taken Master 𝗧𝗏's morning lessons and would have been laboring over Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃's instructions on wielding the bow and arrow well onto the afternoon. But no, Izuku had to satisfy his need for confirmation, only to have his hopes be dashed on the cold floor. "Well, no matter," Izuku said to himself as he bounded on the stairs, taking 2 steps at a time, as he recalled Master 𝗧𝗏's words on the matter regarding his mother's station. The Baroness of Balame was a strong woman. Izuku himself knew that. She'd have to take the brunt of the talk and continue on living. And besides, Izuku knew that a few years from now he'd be taking over the governing of the barony. His mother had made that her express wish that once he struck his 18th birthday, power to rule this land would he transferred to him. He hoped that once he become Baron, he can finally put a stop to all the unnecessary controversy regarding the background of one's nobility. As Izuku ran towards the great doors of the keep, he couldn't help but notice at the amount of servants that milled around the great hall. They greeted him with cheer, smiling and waving as he passed by. But Izuku all noticed the frantic light in their eyes as they moved with a purpose around the hall. Some carried plates of porcelain. Others brought with them pristine white sheets that were embroidered with golden patterns of roses and thorns. A great many seemed to be cleaning the decorations and putting fresh wicks of candles on bronze scones polished to a bright sheen. Curious, Izuku hailed a servant near him, a young man with a few whiskers for a beard, and asked him a question about the preparations. "My lord, it seems as if someone from the capital, an official from the Shining Palace or so, will be arriving this evening," the man said with a quivering voice that cracked in odd words. Izuku nodded and dismissed the man with a grateful nod. The young man bowed and ran towards the door that led to the keep's interior. So there was an official visiting their keep. Izuku thought it was an odd news. As far as he knew, Balame was the farthest of the provinces that is under the Matriarch's dominionship. It was peculiar that this little land of theirs would be regarded by interest. Curious he may be, Izuku knew that he needed to hurry. A good time has passed since he had left his room, and he feared that Master 𝗵𝗃 wouldn't take being late too kindly. Both Master 𝗬𝗏 and Master 𝗵𝗃 seemed to share the sentiment of being on time or face the consequences that Izuku seemed to fall prey today. He ran as fast as he could, passing servants, the knights that patrolled the keep, until he reached the barracks where a solidly built man with a well-kept beard waited. "Master 𝗵𝗃, forgive me if I'm late," Izuku breathed as he stopped. He took great lungfuls of air, staying still as he relaxed his strained muscles from running. A chuckle came from Master 𝗵𝗃, and a bow was then placed on his hands. Izuku took a long look at the curved wood, noting how smooth and firm it was as he tested a few tugs on it through the fine, yet strong, string. "Since you're late for our practice today, young lord," Master 𝗵𝗃 said as he clapped his hands, "we'll be practicing your aim well until the sun sets. Understand?" "Yes," Izuku said with a nod. That wasn't as bad as he anticipated. Master 𝗵𝗃 nodded as well and turned around. "Oh yes, before I forget, let's skip lunch for today as well, and there will be no breaks, okay?" Disbelief marred Izuku's face, but one look from Master 𝗵𝗃, and all the thought of complaining dried up in Izuku's mind. He nodded and mumbled something about not being late again tomorrow. Master 𝗵𝗃 clapped his hands once again and pointed at circle a few paces away. "That red dot at the target," Master 𝗵𝗃 said, his voice firm and commanding. Izuku couldn't help but feel a thrill course through him. "Try hitting that from 25 paces. Gripping the bow so tight that Izuku could feel the sting of the wood, Ni nodded and set about doing what Master 𝗵𝗃 instructed. From the target he took the 25 steps, and from there he faced the target, an arrow nocked and ready to fire. "Breathe," Izuku told himself. The string was taut, his arms and fingers strained from pulling. All he needed to do was release. "Fire," Master 𝗵𝗃 said. Izuku took another deep breath and released the arrow as he exhaled. The arrow whistled past him, and his bow began quivering as its slender frame flew past. Izuku made a sound of surprise as he saw his arrow fly. But then that surprise turned into disappointment as the arrow missed its mark by a large margin. Master 𝗵𝗃 whistled and Izuku hung his head in shame. I'm sorry, Master 𝗵𝗃. I can't seem to hit the mark." "No worries, young lord," the Master 𝗵𝗃 said, patting Izuku on the back. The gesture was rather powerful, and Izuku found himself wincing. He smiled nonetheless. Master 𝗵𝗃 clapped his hands together and gave a furtive glance at Izuku. Somehow, Izuku felt uneasy. "That just means we have our work cut out for us, young lord. And I just don't mean easy work as well. Shall we start then?" The sun rose to its zenith and then fell. And in the span of those moments, Izuku was met with drill after drill. Countless arrows were used. A great many words of encouragement, praise, and consolation were uttered, as well as Izuku's desperate curses. He had pulled bowstring after bowstring so many times that his arms and fingers hurt, strained to the core, but still he missed mark after mark after mark. But there was progress, as each successive shot brought Izuku closer and closer to that red dot. There was a look of pleasure on Master Fingus' face as he watched him. And once the sound of the bells that indicated dusk was coming, he tapped on Izuku's back and smiled. "Well done, young lord," he said as he surveyed the field littered with arrows struck to the ground or to the circle. Izuku smiled weakly and shook his head. "Not yet, Master Fingus. I still haven't struck the target." "Nonsense," Master Fingus boomed, and he motioned his hands towards the mess Izuku had made, encompassing it all. "This is fine work for a beginner, young lord. In fact, significantly better than that of a novice. I can see that you have a talent for archery, one that needs to be nurtured." "Do you really think so, Master Fingus?" Excitement chased away the disappointment inside Izuku's mind as he listened to the words the strong man said as praise. He knew it wasn't a lie. Master Fingus would rather kill himself than tell a deceit, and just the thought of that made Izuku's weak smile turn into a delighted grin as he gripped the bow in his hands. Chuckling, Master Fingus ruffled his hair. "I know so, young lord. You have a talent for archery," he said gruffly. He then turned around and bent to pick up the arrows that littered the ground. "Run along now, young lord. The day has ended, and I hear there are some important individuals are visiting the keep," he called behind his back. "Oh, okay, see you tomorrow, Master Fingus," Izuku replied, feeling a tad disappointed in himself. As much as he wanted to help his teacher clean, he knew greeting these so-called guests were top priority. A lord must always greet those who come to his abode. His mother always told him during the rare times when they interacted. Her eyes were always sharp and calculating during those times. "Do not forget about this, Izuku. Understand?" Izuku understood. That was why he left the burly man to his work and hurried towards one of the small doors that led inside the keep. Once inside, he hurried towards the direction where his room was located, his mind abuzz with thoughts about the coming evening, all the while noticing that a great many lights shone above the keep's ceiling and that the aromas of food drifted in the air. If the words of the servants and Master Fingus were to be believed, then it was just a short time now before these guests arrived. Izuku took a quick appraisal of his current state and deemed his sweat-soaked body, crumpled and dirtied clothes, in need of attention and cleaning. Luckily, what seemed like a legion of servants gathered around the doors to his room. Surprised, Izuku gaped. Then an old woman stepped forward from the crowd, her stern yet warm demeanor melting Izuku's surprise. "My lord, we must make haste," Selena's frail voice started. Her gnarled hands made quick motions prompting Izuku to step into his room. "We don't have much time. They could be here in any moment, and I'm afraid the mistress doesn't take too kindly on being late. She herself knows that. So come, do not dawdle now." And so, without any other warning, Izuku was dragged into his own room, where everything that happened there was more chaos than preparation. As the servants rushed him to take a bath, where the sponges that rubbed against his skin made his flesh pink and hot. He was then taken to his dressing room, naked and shivering, as he was made to wear a tight green vest over a puffy, long-sleeved shirt of white silk embroidered with golden thorns and roses. Brown breeches and black boots polished to an impossible sheen completed the look. Selena sighed as her eyes took in the attire Izuku wore. It was simple, he knew, a bit different from his usual clothes, but the old woman seemed to find it refreshing. "Don't you just look precious, my lord?" she exclaimed as she combed the tangled mess that was Izuku's hair. Of all the things that was needed to be taken care of, this was the most hardest. "I'm sure they'd be impressed by your looks." A nervous smile made its way towards Izuku's face, and he could see it clearly as his reflection showed his treacherous face. Shouldn't lords be confident? Who are they anyway, Selena? Izuku asked, still watching himself in the mirror. Selena's brows furrowed in concentration. Then she shook her head. Northern nobles, I believe. I heard the mistress say that the guests hail from a land north of the Shining Isles. In the frost, I believe. That far? Izuku said as his eyes grew wide with surprise. Now that he saw his expression, he looked kind silly. What could they be doing here, of all places? Oh, there's no use worrying about that, Selena said with a grunt. The comb had caught a snarl in Izuku's hair and old woman was pulling at it much to his discomfort. He winced as the snarl came undone. With a sigh of victory, Selena continued. Most nobles just want to travel, my lord. I'm sure they just came here to Balame passing from a trip. I hope so, Izuku whispered. The sound of a fanfare suddenly blared through the doors. Selena's smile deepened, and she clapped her hands as she regarded her handiwork. There, my lord. A grunt escaped her as she patted away the invisible dust from Izuku's shoulders. Now see to it that this keep has hope yet. A special kind of dread crept up and took hold of Izuku as he took one last look on the mirror. He looked, in a word, like a noble of high birth, with all the education and training gold and power could offer. But it was this kind of dread that pooled a fear around him, that he was just a silly clown wearing nothing but inappropriate clothes. Even though Selena gushed over him, piercing a golden earring with a single emerald on his left ear, Izuku still felt like he looked more fool than regal. His mother had stressed that attire was everything to a noble, and when he dressed, it was made to impress. But he couldn't banish the doubts away, or the feeling that these foreign nobles might look down on him and his mother. Izuku needed to avoid that. Are you ready now, my lord? Selena's voice filled his head. Izuku turned around, breaking the line of his thought, to see the old woman open the door to his room. Gulping, Izuku nodded. He had no choice. He took the first steps, his feet feeling heavy and thick. As much as he wanted sweat to bead his forehead, he knew that he needed to maintain composure. His mother would be disturbed if ever she saw such a sight, and Izuku knew better than to do that to her. He found himself taking the grand staircase that led towards the great hall. In the shadows, Izuku could hear the sounds of trumpets and other instruments as they played a tune of arrival. He hastened his stately pace, wishing that he could run instead. He passed the line servants, the long table laden with magnificent dishes the cooks had whipped up, and hurried towards the large doors that had been opened to meet the guests. Torchlight bathed the green outside as stars and a fat moon appeared over the corpse of the twilight sky. There, Izuku smiled as he saw his mother's back. His pace went even faster. Izuku took a deep breath, his small form shivering as cold air brushed him, and placed himself on his mother's right side. Happiness flared inside Izuku as he saw his mother turn around. He gave her a bright smile, and she, in turn, offered one that was tight and worried. Izuku drank the sight. It was rare for them to meet, much less be beside each other. Izuku knew that his mother had a responsibility to uphold as Balame's baroness. But Izuku wished that they could at least see each other more frequently, and not only when she needed to conduct lessons in etiquette herself. It's good to see that Master Fingus has finally ended his lessons, the Baroness of Balame said as she regarded the gate. Tell me, what progress has been made? Master Fingus told me that I had a natural talent at archery, Izuku said, pride mixing with his voice. Oh, did you hit the target on the first try? No, Izuku replied, his happiness declining a bit. The silence that followed proved to be a mystery to Izuku and prompted him to turn, regarding his mother. Her brows were furrowed, and a concerned expression twisted her lovely face. That's odd. You have a week to practice and learn, however. Izuku, promise me you'll hit the target before the end of the week. Understand? Izuku found himself nodding along to his mother's. He couldn't deny that request, not if he wanted to see the look of displeasure his mother's face now harbored turn into that of anger. Satisfied, The Baroness' face returned to its pinched state as she regarded the gate and the road beyond, lined with torches and knights. It was clear how nervous she was after Izuku saw her bite her lip, albeit momentarily. A look of horror flashed across her face before it finally settled into an expression of calm. Izuku gulped. His mother was slowly coming undone. Do you know more about these nobles, mother? Izuku stuttered as he made a bid to distract her. It seemed to take effect as his mother perked up. They are scions of House Midoriya, his mother started. Izuku's eyes flew wide open. No wonder his mother was so nervous. The visiting nobles were relatives to the matriarch herself. A lump formed in Izuku's throat, and an uneasy smile forced itself of his mouth as he continued to listen. House Todoroki is a distant relative to House Midoriya, and most of their lands are located in the north, in the frozen lands where iron and other metals are mined, called the Frosts, as well as several holdings in the 13 Isles, many smaller islands. Such important guests, Izuku managed to say without twisting his tongue. His mother nodded, and seemed to have not noticed the look Izuku gave to the great gates. Mother, say, why are? The sound of trumpets broke through the question Izuku was about to ask. It snapped his mother's attention, making her body go stiff and eyes wide with dread. There was a smile on her face as she stared at the gate, a smile that was meant to be welcoming, but was all the more horrified. Izuku wasn't feeling better himself. As the dark form of a carriage appeared from the gloom, his heart had suddenly taken it upon itself to escape the confines of his ribs, but to no avail. No words were said as the carriage was fully bathed in the light of the torches. Dark horses screamed at the loud sound of a cracking whip. Izuku felt himself shiver as he watched the carriage pass the guards and the gate into the great courtyard of Keep Balame. It made a circle on the green and stopped in front of where they were standing. The trumpets ceased blaring. The coachman who brought the carriage to a halt stepped down from his seat and ran towards the carriage's door. He gripped the golden knob, twisted it, and opened it aside. Izuku felt like running. A man who can only be called a noble stepped out from the carriage wearing clothes that fit his large body and was finer than what Izuku wore. Golden rings glittered on his fingers as he motioned for the coachman to move aside, lest he be trampled by the noble's dark boots worked with silver. Izuku almost took a step back as he regarded the man's fierce face. His eyes were smoldering blue. It seemed to pierce his soul and made him want to submit something from the very depths of his being. This man, this noble, was scary. Welcome, Lord 𝐒𝐻𝐽, High Lord of House Todoroki. What astounded Izuku wasn't that his mother had found a voice to speak after seeing the man. Instead, it was because of how composed her voice was as she made a curtsy to the Lord. Izuku followed suit, and he heard the grunt of acknowledgement coming from the northern noble. This is a nice abode you have here, my lady, Lord 𝐒𝐻𝐽 said as he crossed his arms. His eyes moved, as if scouring the place. Truly different from my northern home. A flighty chuckle answered Lord 𝐒𝐻𝐽's words, followed by, You need not praise my home much, my lord, come. You must be tired from your journey here. The northern lord grunted, a sound that carried authority as much as it carried gruffness. Yes, the journey has been tiring, yet there is still so much to discuss. But before that, the lord stepped aside from the door. There are still people inside this contraption that needs to get out. Shoto. The lord's voice was loud as it was jarring, and made Izuku flinch as he heard it. He imagined what would happen if that voice had been directed to him, and shivered at the thought of him being unable to think properly. If his imagination was accurate, however, he wished that the person called Shoto was okay. To take the brunt of what Izuku considered was an attack horrified him. Finally, Lord 𝐒𝐻𝐽's voice subsided, and for a blessed moment, Izuku bled his ears to the silence of the night and the soft flutter of the banners against the cold wind. Then, the carriage shook, and a small form appeared from the gloom and stepped out, fully decked in clothes foreign to Izuku's eyes. It appeared to be some sort of robe, its sleeves long and wide, tied with a golden piece of cloth that was stitched with green images of wavy trees. Izuku was mesmerized on the way. The clothes hugged the person's form, but he was more mesmerized by the person himself. Two very different eyes, one in the color of the earth, one in the color of the bright sky, stared at Lord 𝐭𝐽 with stony determination. This Shoto's hair, too, was the definition of contrast, as one side was pristine white, while the other was a deep red. Izuku took a nervous gulp. There was his special kind of dread again, pounding inside his heart. It seemed as if Shoto and he were of the same age, but as Izuku compared himself to him, he felt all the more like a fool. A satisfied and smug smile covered Lord 𝐭𝐽's face as he nodded. "Well then, my lady, let me introduce to you House Todoroki's heir apparent, Shoto Todoroki." Shoto bowed, the very definition of elegance and nobility. "Pleased to meet you, Baroness of Balame." Izuku's mother smiled, her eyes twinkling. She waited for the young lord to raise his head before she placed a hand on Izuku's shoulder. "And this is my son, my lords, heir apparent to the barony of Balame, Izuku of Balame. Welcome to our humble abode, my lords," Izuku managed to say without stuttering. A small sense of pride trickled in him at the thought of such a feat. Lord 𝐭𝐽 grunted again. "Well then, shall we go inside?" he suggested, but at the tone of his voice, it was more command than a request. His mother seemed to take it that way as well, when Izuku saw a light flare inside her eyes. "You seem to have forgotten someone, my Lord 𝐭𝐽," came yet another voice from the carriage. For some reasons, Izuku thought it was familiar. Once again a shadowed figure stepped out, and Izuku knew why that voice felt familiar. The gaunt face of a woman stared at the large noble, an expression of indifference on her face as well as mild annoyance. Lord 𝐭𝐽 looked surprised clearly. He had forgotten her, if she rode with them to Balame. It was a noble's common mistake, however, to forget a servant below their rank. But Izuku knew that woman was more than a servant. She was the head servant of the Shining Palace. "Kotsu." His mother breathed in an astonishingly soft voice. Aunt Kotsu regarded her for a while, before a thin-lipped smile made its way across her face. "It's been a long time, my lady," she replied. Then her eyes went to Izuku and her smile grew even brighter. "And if it isn't little Izuku, oh my, how you've grown," Izuku laughed, surprised to hear how clear, how confident his voice sounded. A quick glance told him that the foreign lords looked surprised as well, Shoto most of all. "It's nice to see you, too, Aunt Kotsu." His aunt was laughing now, an odd sort of sound considering that it sounded more of a bark, but it was all the more merry as she went up to him and gathered Izuku in her arms. Surprised, Izuku managed a hasty embrace of his own, his cheeks burning brightly, before letting go of her so that she can face his mother. To her, she gave a curtsy. "Ah. Yes," Lord 𝐭𝐽 started to say, his face painted with confusion. "I meant to call you as well, mistress. It must have slipped my mind." "You didn't. You forgot about her," came a cool voice. Izuku was midly surprised that it came from Shoto. Lord 𝐭𝐽, too, looked shocked enough that he was left speechless for a couple of moments. Only his smoldering blue eyes spoke the words that were missing from his lips, and those words were words of anger. Shoto stood straight, eyes taking in the almost baleful glare his father gave him. Izuku broke out a cold sweat. What was happening currently was something unexpected, and Izuku knew that the situation was quickly unraveling before him. Lord 𝐭𝐽 looked ready to burst. His eyes were bright. His lips were drawn up in a thin line of displeasure across a face that was slowly getting darker and darker by the moment. Izuku risked a glance at his mother and aunt, but they merely stood and watched, with Aunt Kotsu sporting a look of amusement, completely in contrast to his mother's look of concern. No help was forthcoming from the two, Izuku concluded. As time passed, Izuku could see how close to snapping Lord 𝐭𝐽 was to his son. It was written clearly on his face for all to see. Shoto wasn't helping as well, as the look he casted onto his father was a look that screamed defiance. Izuku didn't know what to do, but he needed to do something, anything, to ease this situation. Smothering his dread and hoping that it wouldn't return at the most inconvenient time, Izuku cleared his throat and caught the attention of the two foreign nobles. Their eyes pierced him like swords, like arrows, but Izuku gave them in what he hoped was his best smile and said, "My lords, the night is deepening, and I'm afraid the food grows cold by the minute. Please, let us enter." A hush seemed to settle around them as Izuku spoke the words, and not long after he had spoken, the high seat of House Todoroki cleared his throat and nodded. "Of course," he said. "My apologies for delaying." "Do not fret," Izuku's mother replied. She turned around. "Please." Lord 𝐭𝐸 nodded and moved, with Shoto following along. They moved past Izuku and gave him long stares. But Izuku, albeit a little nervous, was relieved that the situation has been averted. He watched as the nobles enter and disappear, and now it was only him and his aunt that were left. Izuku held out his hand. "Shall we go, dear aunt?" he said with a smile. Kotsu's dark eyes sparkled, and she laid her hand on his. "You did well, Izuku, so very lord-like of you," she whispered, her voice tinted with pride as they walked. Izuku found himself suddenly bashful. I did only what needed to be done, Aunt Kotsu. Nothing more, nothing less. I wouldn't want the northern nobles to have a bad memory of their visit in Balame." "Not if I can help it," he replied. His aunt chuckled and gripped his hand tight. "Still, all the more lord-like," she said. Then there was a far look that showed in her eyes. "And all the more perfect for it." Confused, Izuku asked, "What?" Comprehension dawned in his aunt's expression, and she shook her head and smiled. "Nothing," she replied, her voice suddenly becoming strained. Izuku's brows furrowed, uncertain. There was certainly something going on in his aunt's mind for him to receive such a reply. But what? Dinner was served on the long table placed on the great hall. Izuku was seated on the right side of his mother, facing the high Lord 𝐭𝐸, who had, thankfully, began conversing with his mother about the state of affairs in Balame. His son, Shoto, was seated next to him, and although Izuku wanted to talk to the heir apparent, there was something in the way he ate, in the way how his eyes would never glance at his direction, that told Izuku that he needed no company. Kotsu, too, chattered away with his mother. She was seated beside Izuku, but the distance didn't deter her one bit as she talked over the things his mother had done in the past while governing the barony. The dinner was a silent affair to Izuku, as he merely played with his leftovers while listening to the adults talk. The soft sounds of flutes played in the background, as well as the lilting strum of a lute, but Izuku found no respite there, despite his best attempts to unwind. Suspicion still pounded inside his head at the thought of what his aunt said. Perfect, but for what? He would question whilst glancing at the smiling face of his Aunt Kotsu. Sometimes, those dark eyes of hers held secrets more guarded than the keep's treasury, but she had said something not clearly meant for Izuku's ears. A slip of those precious secrets his aunt had harbored, and Izuku wanted to know. As much as he wanted to, however, he knew that no amount of pleading, coaxing, or asking would lead him to anywhere if it concerned the gaunt-faced head servant. Deceiving her was out of the question as well, as Izuku's aunt seemed naturally inclined to notice lies with just a look or a sniff. Izuku, too, couldn't bear the thought of lying to her. She was his mother's closest friend, and the only one who saw her not as a servant, but as a noble who is good and just and wise. It would be an insult to him and his mother if Izuku would lie to her just because he heard something that he wasn't supposed to hear. Izuku wallowed over his options, his thoughts and wills scattering like the four winds as each time he made a plan, a small, uncertain part of him would tear it down for him to rebuild anew. Finally, the meal drew to a close and Izuku found himself bowing to the guests as they were led to the chambers to spend the night. Out of the corner of his sight, Izuku saw Shoto give him a quick glance before turning his head to face the stairs. "Well, that settles it for tonight," Izuku heard Aunt Kotsu say with a yawn. He turned around and sure enough, the head servant waved them goodbye as she moved towards the direction of the servants' quarters. "Good night, Izuku," she said. "Good night as well, dear aunt," Izuku replied. He started to bid his mother good night as well, but then saw her walking beside Kotsu. With the look in her face, Izuku knew that his good night would fall onto deaf ears. Izuku merely smiled and proceeded to his room. He undressed, breathing deeply as his tight clothes were finally on the floor and not on his body. Izuku considered taking a bath before going to bed, but as he made his move to his bathroom, his tired bones screamed from hours and hours of training and writing. Groaning, Izuku flopped on the bed instead. Bathing would have to be done early in the morning. Sighing, Izuku thought of what the day had given him and felt his eyelids begin to drop. Too many thoughts, too many secrets. Izuku would have to wait. He closed his eyes and breathed another sigh of relief, but then opened them again as something dawned to him. Could the foreign nobles be a part of this as well? He thought. There was a connection. He knew. His aunt wouldn't ride in a carriage filled with important people if it wasn't in her concern. And it was odd to think that the nobles of House Todoroki, the scions of House Midoriya, would gladly accept the head servant as a travel companion. Izuku wanted to move, wanted to stand up and confront his aunt about it. But his body was too beaten, his thoughts too muddled. He could only groan as he tried. "I'll do it. Tomorrow," he barely registered inside his mind. That was all he could do before the darkness of sleep overtook him. The first thing that Izuku did in the morning was to work on penning an essay explaining the effects of the Matriarch's decision on sending out troops and annexing the eastern portion of continental land under her rule in the three variations of the islandic script: the northern, the west-eastern, and the southern, under the watchful eyes of his ancient teacher, Master 𝗧𝗵𝗲. And as his groggy mind hastened to put ink into the quill, he couldn't help the feeling of being overwhelmed by such a task this early. It came so suddenly as well. Izuku shivered as he remembered that small moment of the morning when he had just been stirring in his bed. All coherent thoughts still fragments inside his mind as he roused. He had distinctly remembered seeing his Aunt Kotsu to assuage his suspicion about the words she had uttered yesterday night. But the words of his teacher had broken that line of though, snapping him awake to see the ancient men holding hard-bound books that had been darkened with age. "Rise and shine, my lord. Today is a new day for learning, and you aren't late for once," Master 𝗧𝗪 had said, his voice cheery, and yet it scratched at the fog of Izuku's waking mind. Blinking, Izuku stood up and stared at his teacher with confusion. "Master 𝗧𝗪," he mumbled, rubbing his tired eyes. He shivered as a cold gust of wind blew inside his room, and he was made all too aware that all he had on were his breeches. "Isn't this a bit early for a lesson?" Chuckling, Master 𝗧𝗪 had waved Izuku's question away with a ruffle on his head. "Nonsense," he had exclaimed. "It is never too early for knowledge, and you know that yourself, my lord." Izuku smiled weakly at his teacher's retort. He did, in fact, know that education was never too late, nor, in his case, too early. But something wasn't right. True, Master 𝗧𝗪 came to teach early, but not this early. Izuku glanced at the open windows to see that the sun hadn't even peaked yet at the mountainous horizon, and that only shades of pink, violet, blue, and yellow had painted the dawning sky. Usually, Master 𝗧𝗪 arrived when the sun had fully appeared on the mountains. Bothered, Izuku relayed his observation to his old teacher. "Oh, those are the Baroness' orders, my lord. To see to you the first thing in the morning, at the earliest time possible," Master 𝗧𝗪 replied. "I couldn't dare oppose the Baroness, nor fail her words, and so, here I am. She said to also teach you the advanced topics, so that you may excel, odd as it may be." "Ah, I see," Izuku replied. Glimmers of understanding connected itself on Izuku's thoughts. He closed his eyes and sighed. His mother wanted him to excel. It seems that the little conversation they had on the day of Lord Inji and Lord Shoto's arrival had lingered in her mind enough for her to take action. Well, Izuku had this coming. Izuku nodded, parting the sheets and twisting himself so that his bare feet touched the cold floor. Very well. Just let me take a quick bath before we start, Master Roughly. Oh, there is no need for that, my lord. We should start immediately. The lesson I have now simply requires such time that a bath would take too much out of it. And now, here he was, shivering in the cold morning, even as he had draped a thick woolen blanket on his unwashed body. Cold prickled at his bare skin, and he shivered ever so slightly at the sensation. Master Roughly should have at least given him leave to dress. But the ancient man had other plans, it seems. And a plan it was. Izuku's head was spinning as he wrote down words on a piece of parchment, his mind a maelstrom, thoughts that surfaced quickly, but sank fast as well. Master Roughly looked pleased, however, with his progress. And so Izuku continued, now writing the flowing northern variation of the Islandic script with hands stained with ink. You seem to be making good progress, my lord, Master Roughly said in front of Izuku, a proud smile on his lips as he read the first essay Izuku had written in the variation he had known ever since he was a young child, the West Eastern. Relief momentarily held Izuku's frame as he nodded and smiled. He was worried that the blocky script was too crudely written, but it seemed that Master Roughly found it adequate enough not to warrant a reprisal. Master Roughly set the paper down and clapped his hands. Well then, how about a pop quiz on history? You can continue writing, of course. You need only to answer my questions, my lord. Without waiting for Izuku to answer, Master Roughly brought the first question. Why did the Matriarch annex this land in the continent? General lawlessness, Izuku answered, his eyes never leaving the paper and the words he wrote. Kingdoms that had been established before the Matriarch took action every week, and often fell prey to the seasonal raids of the nomadic people west to their borders. The Matriarch saw this as a reason to intervene and brought the land into her domain, bringing with it wealth and security against the nomads and their raids. A sound of approval passed through the lips of his ancient teacher. Exactly, he said as he ruffled Izuku's hair once again. Master Roughly did like to do this whenever it was possible. Now, name a kingdom that has once stood in this land. At this, Izuku's brows furrowed as he recalled past lessons in history Master Roughly had taught him. There were many kingdoms, all of them warring and insignificant, but there was one Izuku remembered more clearly than the others. Senwain. The Patriarchy of Senwain. A mirror to the Shining Isle's own matriarch, and yet not, he replied with certainty. Master Roughly ruffled his hair once again, and Izuku found himself laughing as he wrote the final paragraph in the flowing northern script. Very good. And do you know where Senwain is located? Izuku racked his brain, squeezing every bit of knowledge he had about the patriarchal nation, and took a deep breath as he realized the answer to Master Roughly's question. He licked his lips, unsure. The records were uncertain, Master Roughly. Some say Senwain's capital was located along the coast facing the Calm Deep, but others claim that it is in here, in Balame, where Senwain's seat of power was located. As he answered, Izuku had finished writing the final sentences to his essay. He pored through the words with a quick eye, seeking for errors in which he found none. Satisfied, he gave it to ancient Master Roughly, who nodded and began reading it right away. You are correct, my lord, Master Roughly said as he read. Two conflicting records claimed different capitals to the Patriarchy, and much of the people had forgotten being under its rule. Very well done. Izuku chuckled, albeit he was feeling a bit tired before of the effort he had to expend. Thank you, Master Roughly. I couldn't have answered if it weren't for your lectures on the topic. Master Roughly chuckled, shaking his head in mock dismay. Shame, young lord. You flatter me too much. His ancient finger then pointed at the blank piece of paper on Izuku's desk. But I'm afraid flattery wouldn't help you learn the southern scrawl, my lord. Smiling, Izuku dipped the quill into the inkwell and started writing. "Well, I tried," he said as he wrote the words. A few more paragraphs and oral quizzes later, and finally, when the sun had risen well above the mountains and the heat of summer rolled into Izuku's room, Master 𝗏𝗏 bid his goodbye. He had marked his papers as excellent, only noting 1 or 2 errors on Izuku's penmanship in the southern variation. But his points were valid, as were his answers in each of the essays, and Master 𝗏𝗏 couldn't be more impressed. "Why, I'd believe you've outsmarted a scholar in the Shining Isles, my lord," he had said as he chucked away the books he carried. Praise often made Izuku a tad anxious, and happy the words the ancient teacher had said made him feel relieved. Izuku sighed as he stood, silently thanking the gods for making him gather his wits enough for that morning. If he'd been dallying with those essays, he was sure it would have taken a longer time for him to be alone in his room. But thankfully, it didn't. And now, Izuku stretched out his arms and legs, his fingers tired beyond measure. The bed looked inviting to Izuku, but he knew he had a whole day up ahead of him. A day of revelations and secrets. But the day need not start with him reeking of yesterday's sweat. The cold of the morning had suppressed his smell earlier, a phenomenon Izuku had given thanks over and over again, but now that the room's temperature had risen, Izuku could smell his odor to his heart's content. He threw the blanket back to the bed in fear of the cloth catching his stink, but he realized that he had slept in those yesterday night. The deed had already been done. There was no use for lamenting, and Izuku now wanted a bath to banish away the smell of dried sweat that had clung to him yesterday night before it got worse. In the coming summer heat, Izuku knew this stink would increase tenfold. He considered calling Selina to attend to him, but the doors to his room opened to permit the old caretaker in with 2 servants behind her, their heads bowed low. "Good morning, my lord," Selina greeted as she came up to him, the 2 servants following after her. Izuku prepared to say a greeting, but the old woman swiftly raised her hands and shook her head. She took a deep breath, then sniffed. "By the Matriarch, you stink, my lord." A nervous laugh escaped Izuku's lips as he felt heat building up in his cheeks that wasn't a part of the summer sun. "About that, Selina. Could you make the bath for me?" "Why, of course, my lord," she replied, her voice rising so that the 2 servants heard and hurried into the chamber where Izuku's bathroom was located. There were already buckets of water inside the bath, courtesy of the servant who came inside his room a bit earlier when Master 𝗏𝗏 had been around. Izuku now only needed to wait for the servants to finish preparing the bathwater, and hoped that they had scented it with his favorite scent, lilac. As they waited for the servants to finish, Selina had busied herself tidying up Izuku's room. At first, Izuku had protested the woman was beyond her years of being able-bodied. Sure, she didn't hobble when she walked, and hadn't used the cane his mother had gifted her in her 60th birthday. But Izuku was worried that Selina would exhaust herself doing chores that he should be the one doing. One look from her, however, sent his mouth slamming shut without any protest escaping. She just had that way. She was disdainfully eyeing his hands, done with her chores in his room, when the servants that had entered the bathing chamber had come out from the doors to beckon Izuku in. Selina gave him a towel and said, "Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃 has told me that you need to be at the barracks before high morning. Your clothes will be ready after you've taken the bath, my lord." Thanking Selina, a thought occurred to Izuku as he considered Selina's position in the keep's household. As caretaker, she would be knowledgeable of the rooms of the keep and would have kept an eye on rooms that had been used. She, most of all, knew the rooms of the servants' quarter, of who was inside it, and of who was using it for an overnight stay. Selina did not need to know the details as well, and so Izuku asked her which room his aunt had stayed for the night. A far look surfaced onto Selina's face, and silence descended on them. Izuku's brows furrowed, uncertain what the situation meant. Finally, Selina blinked the far-off look away and replied, "If you're looking for your aunt, my lord, I suggest you go to the keep's room of the roses." "Why is that?" "Oh, I just saw 𝐒𝐭𝐲 enter there when I was out doing inspection, my lord. Selena replied nonchalantly, smoothing her skirt as she did so. The foreign nobles also entered there, as well as the mistress. What could they be talking about? That snapped Izuku's wandering attention back to the old woman. All thoughts of taking baths or performing feats of archery was pushed at the back of Izuku's mind as he asked the old caretaker, "Did you hear anything?" Gritting his teeth so that the excitement that threatened to upend him. He watched the old woman's expression turn into a dismayed one. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, my lord. I only heard voices, and I fear my ears have begun failing me lately," she replied, her voice suddenly frail, as if old age had finally caught up to her. Izuku nodded, battling away the dismay that he knew had begun showing in his face and eyes. With nothing more to exchange, he bid Selena and thanked the servants as he entered the bath. There, he sank himself in the scented water and watched as the water calmed into small ripples that ran throughout the borders of the bathtub. He began rubbing himself, however, scooping up the water to wash away yesterday's grime and lathering himself with his favorite soap. His suspicions had been correct. Somehow, the nobles are in league with his aunt. But knowing that his mother was also part of this unknown scheme was a shock to Izuku that soon passed into numbness. Of course, his mother was his aunt's most trusted and closest friend. She had said that to him when Izuku had first seen his aunt Kotsu. There was no time. He needed to get to the bottom of this mystery, now more than ever. Izuku washed up and wrapped a robe around himself as he left the bathroom. His room was empty when he opened the door, but on his bed were the clothes Selena had prepared for the day, specifically chosen with the knowledge of his training with Master 𝗵𝗃. Archery will have to wait, Izuku concluded as he put on his clothes. He hated being late to Master 𝗵𝗃's class, but the situation required him to steal a few minutes from the muscled man. Izuku just hoped that Master 𝗵𝗃 was forgiving like yesterday when he had arrived late. Done changing, Izuku wasted no time putting on his faded red boots and ran towards the doors. He had a rough plan on what to do once he reached the Room of the Roses, and he hoped with all his might that whatever thing that was happening right there was still going on. Izuku, too keen on refining the rough plan he had in mind, failed to notice a person that had been standing in front of his room's threshold. When Izuku did realize the form of the person, it was all too late for him as he tripped, spooked by the way Master 𝗵𝗃 smiled, and fell face first into the floor. Izuku winced at the pain his action brought upon, but he was held up by Master 𝗵𝗃's beefy arms as he chuckled. Izuku merely looked at him, dazed. "Come now, young lord, you look as if you've seen a ghost," Master 𝗵𝗃 exclaimed. Master 𝗵𝗃, Izuku exclaimed once the initial shock had passed him and had left surprise along its wake. He broke out of the man's grasp and stared at him with unbelieving eyes. "But Selena said that." "Oh, I figured you'd be surprised when I came here," Master 𝗵𝗃 replied, a grin forming on his face as he helped Izuku stand on his own 2 feet. "And I apologize for that, young lord. But you see, you take baths that are way too long. I had thought you'd be late again, so I came here to personally get you." Izuku nodded, understanding. With Master 𝗵𝗃 coming to escort him to the barracks, Izuku would be hard-pressed not to take his lessons in exchange for a few minutes of spying in the Room of the Roses. Master 𝗵𝗃 just had that look that spoke of an eagerness to the day, no doubt related to Izuku's continued lessons on archery. This troubled Izuku, whose very being screamed to go to where Selena had told his mother, his aunt, and the foreign nobles had holed themselves in but ultimately decided against it. Word would reach his mother if he skipped his lessons with Master 𝗵𝗃, and that would earn Izuku a displeased look in her otherwise beautiful face and would, he had no doubt, further alienate him from their estranged relationship. Sighing in defeat, Izuku nodded to Master 𝗵𝗃, and then the journey towards the barracks was on the way, stopping in the kitchens for a light breakfast of eggs and beef jerky. It was a missed opportunity, Izuku knew, but he hoped there was still something he can glean about it all. Maybe Aunt Kotsu would say something once again, if I distract her enough. he thought as the two of them arrived at the barracks. His plan might be plausible. Izuku wouldn't be deceiving her. He'd just be taking her attention away from the secrecy. Master Fingus handed him the bow he had used yesterday and gave him a quiver filled with arrows. Even with knowledge of something happening beyond Izuku's knowledge, he still couldn't help but feel the thrill of wielding the bow and arrow once again. 3 targets were placed on different positions across Izuku. One hung from a branch of a tree. The other stood at his center on a stack of hay. The last one, however, gave Izuku a chill as he noticed how the target was made to look like a person. Its head painted red as the mark. Somehow, seeing it made Izuku nervous. Would he be harming someone in the future? Today, young lord, you will try to hit the red marks on 2 of these 3 targets. Understand? Master Fingus said from a distance behind Izuku. The Baroness has made it her express wish to see you excel in archery over the course of this week, so we'll do just that. There were no more words that Izuku had uttered as he did what he was told. Drawing and releasing and drawing again was the rhythm that Izuku had taken in favor as he passed the whole high morning until high afternoon. His fingers were tired beyond measure, first beaten by the quill as he wrote word after word, and now utterly crushed by the strain of pulling the bowstring again and again. Ho's shoulders ached, his back was sore, and sweat stung his eyes as he blinked away the ever-growing fatigue that taxed his vision, turning the targets around him into blurry and bright shapes. At the back of his mind, a small voice told him to take a break. But Izuku wouldn't. Not now, not yet. One of the 3 targets had an arrow struck on its red center. One more and Izuku promised himself to take a rest. Izuku took a deep breath, nocked an arrow, pulled the string taut with screaming fingers, and released. The arrow flew, passing over the field littered with failures and tired attempts, whistling through the air. Izuku held his breath, watching, eyes growing wide as the arrow struck the target dead center, the arrow quivering with force. Closing his eyes with blossoming relief, Izuku loosed a breath of victory. "Well done, young lord," boomed Master Fingus' voice from behind him. Izuku felt something fluffy settle on the messy locks of his hair, and found out that the man had given him a towel. "Wipe yourself, young lord. Then, take a rest," Master Fingus said as he busied himself with cleaning. "You earned it with your excellent performance." A smile so bright that Izuku feared it would tear through his face appeared on the very place he feared it to be. But he didn't protest at it, and didn't protest at the surge of euphoria he received from hearing those words and of the sight of the 2 targets with their arrows. Wiping his face with the towel, he gave his goodbye to his teacher and dashed towards the keep's interior. High afternoon it was, but the heat, the sun hanging low in the west, still gave the world a wicked baking. Izuku decided to take a bath. He was running towards the hall now when he noticed the 2 foreign nobles, the High Lord of House Todoroki and his son, Shoto Todoroki, were descending the great staircase, 2 servants carrying their luggage behind them. One thought surfaced in Izuku's sun-baked mind as he saw the 2 and the servants carrying their belongings. They were leaving. The thought of it made Izuku feel as if he was suddenly doused with cold water. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, bowing at the 2 when they stopped to meet him as well. "My lords, are you leaving?" Izuku asked while gasping for breath. It was unbecoming of a noble, he knew, but they seemed not to care about his blunder at all. It was Lord Enji who answered, the look on his eyes piercing Izuku like 2 swords. "Ah, yes. There are some estates that we need to visit before the week ends. You and the Lady of Balfame were most generous to offer us hospitality for the night. Please, excuse us. And if you are looking for your aunt," a soft voice suddenly said. "She has already left right after lunch. Goodbye, Izuku." And with that, Izuku watched as the 2 nobles moved past him, his eyes focused on the noble with 2 contrasting colors for his hair the most. His aunt had left before he even had the chance to ask her, and now the nobles are as well. Izuku's fists tightened around themselves, his fingers screaming even more at the pressure. But it was all too late. There was nothing he can do. Today was not a day for revelations. The sun was high in the mountains when Kiyoshi placed Balfame's seal on the last document that carried important agreements between the merchants of the town. The merchants wanted to export the produce that came from the local fishers, only that there was a bit of a disagreement between the two parties that had come to draw the conclusion. Kiyoshi sighed as she rolled the document and covered it in oilskin, placed it on a leather tube. She'd have one of the messengers take that into the town to inform the Guild of Merchants and the Guild of Fishers about the verdict she had given. Kiyoshi just hoped that the compromise to their impasse had been handled adeptly by her. She shook her head at the thought. If Kotsu was here, she would have laughed at her and mocked her for showing such uncertainty in a situation. A noble is never uncertain. She had said that to Kiyoshi over their lessons. And Kiyoshi knew better than to show uncertainty, lest vultures descend on her and feed upon those doubts. But Kotsu wasn't here, much to Kiyoshi's relief. She hadn't heard of the once head servant since that time when she had visited her keep with the High Lord of House Todoroki and his heir apparent. That had been some 8 years ago. Kiyoshi marveled at how a long time ago that meeting had been, of how they hastily had made plans and compromises during that one afternoon. And just like that, Kotsu had disappeared from the known world. She hadn't disappeared entirely, of course. What Kiyoshi did here was that she no longer worked at the Shining Palace anymore, because of some incident regarding her and the new batch of servants that she had trained herself. Gossip moved fast, even in territories as far and as remote as Balfame, and it was easy to talk to it with the nobles who passed by for vacation, whose mouths never ceased to spit word after word, rumor after rumor, to her. That is, when the nobles themselves do not know who they were talking to. Kiyoshi sighed as she stood from her desk, stifling a yawn as she watched the still rising sun in the horizon. A new day, a new beginning, and yet all Kiyoshi wanted to do was to curl up in bed and catch the sleep she had missed on countless nights of just worrying and being buried on duties. She placed a hand on her cheek, an unconscious gesture by now, and wondered if her face still had the prettiness that it had before she had become the Baroness of Balfame. She would regret seeing her beauty go, as she had envisioned herself as some battered noble with gray strands of hair sticking out from her otherwise perfectly combed head, and with a face beset of wrinkles accumulated from years of constant worrying and frowns. It was stressful being a noble, and it was more stressful to become the talk of the town, even after she had made reforms and raised the standard of living for the people. Beauty now seemed an impossible dream if she was attacked on different fronts that needed immediate attention. And so Kiyoshi had said to herself that her beauty would just have to endure it, and that she would definitely make it up for it when the time has come for her to finally step down as the Baroness of Balfame in favor of Izuku. A tight smile forced its way into Kiyoshi's mouth thinking about it. But there was no use. What would happen will happen. And it had been made clearly to her during that meeting 8 years ago of her position in the grand scheme of things the now missing Kotsu had pulled from the darkness. There on a small table with a solitary chair overlooking the mountains in the east sat a porcelain cup of steaming 𝗧𝗧. A servant must have placed it there when Kiyoshi had been distracted from reading the documents handed to her to be signed or reviewed. It was a gesture of kindness to Kiyoshi, to her tired mind and body most especially. But she knew better than to hope that the servant who brought this to her acted out of kindness and concern than to the duties placed on them. Being a noble certainly had its advantages. The power and authority and wealth that came with the title was undeniably euphoric. But the things that came with the good were more vicious than anything Kiyoshi had even hoped for. Selena had been a prelude to that. And now, after 18 years of living and ruling the barony, Kiyoshi had finally learned its true depth. Still, she was thankful for the gesture, even if it had been born out of duty, and took a sip of the steaming drink. The bittersweet taste of the dark 𝗧𝗧 filled Kiyoshi's mouth. In no time, the beans that had been crushed to make Rai's wonderful drink would do their work on her body, setting each fiber ablaze with energy that the fatigue she felt now would fade into distant memory. Kiyoshi took another sip from the cup once again, exhaling the drink scent as she sat down and admired the view the window provided her of the mountains and the large, rolling hills. Izuku would have all of this, she knew. Kiyoshi also knew that his rule would be well received by the common folk as a pure-blooded noble through and through. Unlike her that had been raised to the station and had to fight for the position, and for the uneasy respect of the people in the keep and in her barony. At the back of her mind, she faintly realized that her thoughts had drifted once again into the matriarch's bastard son. But she couldn't avoid those thoughts now and the concern they carried with it. Izuku's birthday was coming fast. Just a shy week away from today. There would be a celebration. Kiyoshi had made plans for that, where all of the town and the keep would celebrate Izuku's coming of age. But what Kiyoshi was afraid of came after the party. When the dust of merriment had settled, and the mantle of power over Balame had been passed on to him, Kiyoshi shivered. Izuku would do well. She had ensured it with all the education and training that her power as a baroness could muster, and had made Izuku not unlike other nobles from the West. Never would the people question his ability to rule, nor alienate him from the common folk as well. But it was the words Kotsu had said to her, to them, during that time in the stifling room where the pungent scent of roses mingled with her dread. When the time comes, his position as a baron would serve him to cement his claim, were the exact words Kotsu had said, revealing to Kiyoshi the plan she had hatched and nurtured over years. Thinking back, Kiyoshi had been a fool to agree to such a thing, but she had made a promise to Kotsu, a promise to follow her instructions without fail. A bitter taste found its way into Kiyoshi's mouth, and it did not come from the warm afar in her hands. That time was almost here. Only that Kotsu had suddenly disappeared. It had been a cause of concern when Kiyoshi had heard of it, for the gaunt-faced woman with dark, commanding eyes was the mind of the scheme they were attempting to pull off. And without her in the forefront of it, Kiyoshi was left in the dark as to what she would do. Had the plan failed in the beginning? Did Kotsu realize the enormity of it and its consequences and had suddenly bolted out, leaving the plan in shambles? Thinking about it would do nothing to Kiyoshi, but make her position in the scheme more strained than she had made it to be. It was best to just go with the original plan. To make Izuku the Baron, and to wait until the people Kotsu had made alliances with arrive in her keep to deal with Izuku. Frowning, she brought the cup to her lips and took a sip, then made a sound of vexation as she realized that the affair was no more. Setting the cup down with a loud thud, she leaned back into her chair and returned her gaze to the scenery before her, her thoughts muddling in the darkness. She hadn't even considered Izuku in all of this. How the child would react when he would have to be told the truth of his royal lineage. Kiyoshi could only imagine the shock, the hurt, and the betrayal she would cause to the child. Child no more, she thought to herself, and for a brief moment, a strong desire welled deep inside her. A desire to see the child she had raised from infancy to manhood. A child that will be the center of bloodshed when the time came. That desire was enough to make Kiyoshi stand and make her way towards the doors to her study. Opening it, she was met with a puff of air that warmed her skin and brought her the scent of flowers and fresh grass. The long winter had ended in their lands, and now was the peak of spring. It was the season of new beginnings, and Kiyoshi knew that if she would have a change of heart now, this moment was the right time to start. She closed the doors behind her silently and moved with the precise grace of a lady. Even as she hastened her steps on the marble floor, Kiyoshi kept a smile to herself as she remembered learning the very basics of becoming a noble lady, specifically on the way how they walked. Kotsu had found it vexing when she learned that Kiyoshi, after how many years of serving under the nobles, had never once learned to walk like them. Every female servant serving under a lady is like that, she had exclaimed, aghast when Kiyoshi had sprained her ankles from attempting to walk. Back in those days, Kiyoshi had always felt indignation when Kotsu talked to her with that sort of tone in her voice. "That's because I don't care," she had replied, her face almost challenging the look of irritation the gaunt-faced woman had on her face. "They can walk to death for all I care." Kotsu had sighed and shook her head. We have our cur out for us. Now, girl, start from the beginning. Kyoshi now looked at the way sh glided on the polished floor, her feet light and dainty, as if her legs were of a fawn in a spring glade. She hailed a servant and asked her where Izuku was at the moment, and the servant answered that the young lord was busy training in the barracks with the keep's master of arms, 𝗃𝗃. Kyoshi thanked the maid and bid her to return to her earlier duties, but a quick glance indicated her that the servant had done the opposite of what she had ordered. Instead, she ran to where the servant's quarter was located, no doubt to talk about the encounter the servant had on the halls this morning. Kyoshi stifled a sigh. Even with the grace of a lady, she still wasn't immune enough to gossip about her. And Selena had done her job well enough to train servants of her caliber as well. It didn't matter. Soon, Selena would have to face the fact that she was nothing more but an ancient crone now. Influential to the staff she may be, but Kyoshi knew her time was running fast. Kyoshi didn't find comfort nor happiness in seeing the old caretaker die, but she knew that her death would be a terrible loss to the servants. The old caretaker might just as well become forgotten memory if that happened. Clearing those thoughts away, Kyoshi descended the great staircase that led to the grand hall of the keep and passed the servants who curtsied to her as she walked by. Ahead of her, the great doors were thrown wide open, letting in the light of the spring day as well as the faint smell of blooming roses. She took a deep breath, taking in the refreshing air, and proceeded to where the barracks were located. Upon arriving, she hid herself in the shadows of the columned archway of the keep, watching at the growing crowd of servants as they watched Izuku practice with his archery on horseback. A loud cheer erupted from the crowd at the sight of Izuku, hitting the red mark that hung on a nearby tree as he zoomed past it. Kyoshi didn't fail to notice that most of Izuku's audience were young women as well, and on how their eyes clouded over at the sight of their young lord. Kyoshi couldn't blame them for fawning over him. However, as Izuku's transformation from an endearing child of 10 to a young man was surprising. The years had been kind to Izuku, generous actually. Once a scrawny child had now turned into a fine gentleman of grace and skill and beauty. Kyoshi knew that Izuku was intelligent than most scholars. She remembered how one such scholar had been defeated by Izuku in a battle of wits some years ago, when Izuku was allowed to tour the town of Balame. That scholar from the 13 Isles Academia had come to Balame for a vacation, only that he had harassed the townfolk until Izuku had stepped in and put an end to it all. She smiled fondly at the memory. Izuku was more than a great scholar. He was an adept diplomat as well. Ah, the young lord is so charming. One of the servants that watched, a young girl with sandy hair, sighed as she watched Izuku. I know. And he's got the attitude to match his looks as well, one other replied. A rather large woman, but Kyoshi could see the youth in her excited face. You remember that fisher's daughter in the docks? The one who is all bubbly and smiling? The earlier servant frowned, then she nodded. You mean that 𝗬𝗎𝗎 girl? The one with the short hair who always has her head in the clouds. Why, what happened? I heard the young lord offered her a scholarship at the local schoolhouse, but she refused. The servant crinkled her nose in disdain upon hearing those words. Kyoshi was surprised as well. Izuku had offered this 𝗬𝗎𝗎 a scholarship. The boy was kind, however, and Kyoshi could just let this one slide. After all, it seems that Izuku was making mutual relationships with the townspeople, and that itself was a smart move. Lucky her, the first servant replied. But to deny the young lord's generosity, how pathetic. There was no denying the jealousy that rolled of the two servants as they watched the rest of Izuku's training. Kyoshi almost loosed a laugh at the sight of how their eyes scoured at Izuku's exposed chest, where his muscles strained and gleamed with sweat under the morning sun. Not only had Izuku become a scholar, but he had the bearings of a warrior and a comely face. A combination no peer of Izuku could resist, or those even older than him. Another loud cheer broke free from the gathered crowd, and 𝐭𝐽𝐲 looked just in time to see the quivering of the arrow as it struck Izuku's final target, a parody of a man's body. Hay spilled from the torn cloth where the arrow struck it, where it once formed the head of the dummy. Despite knowing that it was merely a target, 𝐭𝐽𝐲 couldn't help the chill that crept up to her skin as she stared at the target made of rags. Izuku had begun waving at the crowd, on his face a bright, triumphant smile. His bow was slung across his chest, while the quiver at the side of the saddle lay empty of arrows. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 willed herself to banish the dread and smile. She took a step forward, revealing herself from the shadows, and Izuku's eyes widened in an instant. "Mother," he exclaimed, dismounting from his horse the moment her uttered the words. The crowd parted, surprised at the sudden appearance of the mistress of the keep, and murmured hasty apologies before they dispersed into different directions. Izuku smiled at her as he walked up to her. "What brings you here, mother?" he asked as he wiped away the sweat that clung to his skin with a towel. "I had thought that you have duties yet to perform." "Oh, I finished early," 𝐭𝐽𝐲 replied, "and came to see your progress. And by the looks of it, you did well, Izuku. I am pleased." A light blush dusted Izuku's freckled face as his joy showed itself on his face. He brought the towel to his face, no doubt embarrassed with himself. Thank you, mother," he mumbled, eyes not meeting 𝐭𝐽𝐲's own. A frown almost made its way across 𝐭𝐽𝐲's face at the sight of Izuku's behavior. It was unbecoming of a noble to act like that. But 𝐭𝐽𝐲 knew she'd had to accept what Izuku is now, especially since his special day was coming fast. Instead, 𝐭𝐽𝐲 told Izuku of the plans for his coming-of-age ceremony and later transfer of power, while he dressed. At first Izuku's eyes had widened at the grandeur at the planned activities 𝐭𝐽𝐲 had in mind. But as they made their way for lunch, an event that they rarely had time to take together, Izuku had relented on one condition, and it was that the people of the town in Balame were allowed to attend the celebration in the keep. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 had consented to the request and made a note to increase the amount of food needed to be prepared. She had earlier planned to send letters to the neighboring estates and nobles that she had good connections with. But even then, she was afraid they wouldn't heed to her call. It was an assurance if there were real people who would come and not just empty promises. After that they ate lunch in the kitchens, much to the surprise of the servants and the cooks. Izuku chattered happily away with 𝐭𝐽𝐲, talking about the lessons he took with his new teacher, the scholar from the 13 Isles famed academia itself, whom Izuku had beaten before. Since the ancient 𝗧𝗏 had passed away 2 years ago, 𝐭𝐽𝐲 never thought that she'd see Izuku be happy about a new teacher ever since Master 𝗧𝗏 had departed the world. But it seems that things were constantly changing. Finishing lunch, 𝐭𝐽𝐲 bid goodbye to Izuku as she took her leave. But before her feet ever struck one of the steps on the stairs, Selena, along with a boy much younger than Izuku, entered the halls with haste. 𝐭𝐽𝐲 stopped. Something in Selena's eyes told her that immediate attention was needed. Izuku was suddenly there to intercept the old woman in his hands, and together, the three of them walked towards her. There was a concerned expression on Izuku's face as he stared at Selena's frightened one. But 𝐭𝐽𝐲's attention immediately landed on the boy clutching the old woman's arms. They were shaking, and the black eyes of the boy were filled with tears that trailed down on his dirt-stained cheeks. "My lady," Selena's hoarse voice suddenly broke out. Terrible news. One of the border villages had fallen to the raids of the nomads. "What?" 𝐭𝐽𝐲 exclaimed, alarmed by the words. She looked at Izuku and told him to fetch the master of arms immediately and rounded up on the old woman. How come one of the border villages had fallen? What of the border guards stationed there to defend it? Selena had to catch her breath. But it was the boy who answered 𝐭𝐽𝐲 with quivering lips. They broke through the wall and overwhelmed the guards," he said as tears fell down from his face once again. He closed his eyes and 𝐭𝐽𝐲 saw his grip tighten on Selena's clothes. My family is still in there, please. Lady, you have to help us. Please. Do not worry, child, she said as she placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Help will come. As they waited for Izuku to arrive with the Master of Arms, Kiyoshi had Selena write everything the child named Izumi had known from the initial attack, as Kiyoshi pressed him for more information. Most of the things he said were vague, but there was one thing that was clear to Kiyoshi and provided her hope. According to Izumi, the town had another wall as a second line of defense against invaders and raiders, albeit a significantly smaller one than the first that had been breached. Selena wrote with a rapid hand, and Kiyoshi prayed to the gods that this town's defenders were more than enough to hold the raiders at bay, while the reinforcements still prepared. Finally, the Master of Arms arrived with Izuku wearing his gleaming armor, a sword hanging on his belt, and with a grim look on his face. Izuku, too, looked grim as Kiyoshi noticed he was wearing his training leathers and bracers. A look of determination swept his face as he gripped the bow on his shoulders. "No, you will not go," Kiyoshi said with all the authority she could muster at the sight of Izuku ready for battle. "I forbid it." For a moment his features softened, the determination fading in his eyes, as well as the strength he applied on the bow. But the same things returned once again to confront Kiyoshi. Stronger now, more determined. "Nonsense." It was Selena who spoke, a look of spite in her eyes as she handed the paper to Master 𝗵𝗃𝗧. "We need all the men we can muster to defend and drive out those raiders. And if the young lord wants to go, then let him." It's all right, mother." Izuku came to Selena's defense, his green eyes bright, so infinitely different from the one who he got it from. "I can defend myself and fight back if the need arises. I promise to take care of myself, mother, so please." It was a long time before Kiyoshi answered Izuku's plea. Her very being screamed to deny Izuku of his request. The perils of entering a fight were enormous and many. She shook her head, not liking the idea at all, but all the same replied, "Fine, if you wish it." She then turned to the Master of Arms, putting all the authority in her voice that it rumbled. "You know what to do, Sir 𝗵𝗃𝗧, and keep my son out of harm's way." The Master of Arms pounded a fist to his chest where his heart was located. He stood straight and still, his eyes bright with conviction. "Your will, my lady. I will keep the young lord safe, on my word as a knight." Towards Izuku, who clutched her hands in a tight grip, she said softly, "Do not die." "I won't," was all his reply as he hastened to catch up with the Master of Arms. Kiyoshi was left with Selena and Izumi as they watched the two figures leave. "Please, keep him safe," Kiyoshi found herself whispering. Izuku's mind was filled with the image of Izumi's expression as he mounted on his horse just outside the gate of Keep Balame. A large contingent of knights, 150 strong, bowed their heads as he rode towards the front of their assembled column, next to the Master of Arms and his teacher in the arts of battle, Master 𝗵𝗃𝗧. A grim expression was fixed on his teacher's face as he read the words on the paper Selena had given, and in each sweep of his eyes, his expression hardened even more that Izuku doubted he'd ever see the strong man smile once again. Master 𝗵𝗃𝗧 closed his eyes and sighed, shaking his head as he gave the paper for Izuku to read. Upon taking the piece of paper, Izuku wasted no time in reading it. His eyes scoured the blocky script written elegantly by the hands of Selena, each word making Izuku think more and more of the boy that was now resting inside the keep, and for his family and the border town still under siege from the nomads. Anger coursed steadily inside Izuku as he read the final words of the paper and folded it for safekeeping. Those final words were clear in his head, shining bright like a brand made of smoldering flames. The very fate of that town and Izumi's family might as well depend on the arrival of their force. It was a revelation that Izuku wasted no time to ponder. He looked at Master 𝗵𝗃𝗧 and nodded. He replied, his eyes hardening even more, and signaled the march to begin. From what they had gathered from their hastily made battle plan, the border town Izumi had come from was a few distance away from where the keep was located, just past the rolling hills and into the Great Plains. With the rate of their march, Izuku had estimated that they'd reach the border town in just enough time to relieve the main force that battled against the raiders. That is, of course, if the raiders hadn't turned around to flee. Izuku knew that a great many battles with the nomads can be mostly called skirmishes, rather than actual battles because of how quick they were to attack and flee once they did certain damage, and had gained a considerable amount of loot. However, the fact that they had breached the town's first wall was a disconcerting revelation to Izuku that hinted at something more sinister than a seasonal raid. The look Master Fingus had as they passed through grassy, sunlit terrain was enough to confirm Izuku's suspicion that somehow, what happened now in that border town was a full-on battle. Izuku tightened his hold on his bow as he checked his supply of arrows that he carried with him, making sure each quiver that had been fastened to his saddles were filled with arrows. As he counted and checked, his mind couldn't help but wander back into the plan. They were only a relieving force, Master Fingus had stated. Their purpose was to protect the townsfolk from the raiders and to aid the defenders by reinforcing their numbers, and to wait until a much larger force arrived to drive the raiders out. Carrier pigeons bearing small letter asking for aid on the besieged border town from neighboring garrisons had been sent already upon their departure. The force Izuku was with now just needed to hold out and evacuate the town successfully. Despite of that plan, however, a plenty of unsavory things could still happen to the keep's force and Izuku himself. His mother's words echoed inside his mind as the scenery changed from forested into that of rolling hills extending as far as the eye can see. He had promised his mother that he would be safe, that he would keep himself safe. But thinking on that boy's miserable bearings made Izuku see red, had his mind running into a frenzy. He would see to it that he kept himself safe at all times, but he wouldn't just fight in the sidelines when the battle ensued. No, those raiders will pay to what they've done to the town and to Izumi. Izuku knew that he should have these feelings inside him in check, but try as he might, he couldn't stop the anger from filling him. "Are you all right, young lord?" came Master Fingus' voice as he rode beside Izuku, eyes low and searching. Confronted with that question, Izuku could only hold his silence for a moment before bursting into a sigh of irritation and concern. I don't know, Master Fingus," Izuku said, his voice hoarse. Gritting his teeth, he shook his head at the prospect of seeing the border in flaming ruins, where bodies had been scattered like dust on the wind. Beaten, broken, their lifeless eyes staring at nothing but the empty sky as the force his mother had mustered arrived too late to help the people. It horrified Izuku. It made him shiver just thinking about that happening. What would Izumi's expression be when he had learned that they'd arrived too late to do anything? "I'm just afraid that we won't make it in time." "Nonsense, young lord," Master Fingus boomed, slamming a hand on Izuku's shoulders. The force wasn't enough to hurt Izuku, but he still felt the power in those words, in those gestures, and he flinched. Master Fingus' expression was serious, enough that Izuku knew it could break rocks and boil the seas. "We'll arrive in time to help, my lord. I give you my word." Holding on to those words for hope and strength, Izuku steeled himself for the coming battle. A wider dirt road had opened to their force upon turning. Izuku noticed the fresh prints of horse hooves on the loamy earth. Master Fingus dismounted from his saddle and grazed at the hoof print with his hands. "It's the trail to the border town," he called, his voice loud and clear for the men to hear. Several loud voices echoed Master Fingus' words, and soon they were galloping at full speed to where the dirt road led them. Izuku kept his eyes trained on the road ahead, searching for people that may know the state of Izumi's town. But to now avail, the road was eerily devoid of human and animal life. Only the hoof prints were a clear sign of departure, a clear sign of how Izumi had escaped the village all on his own astride a large beast. There! A loud shout coming from one of the soldiers behind Izuku broke his focus on the path ahead. He slowed, turning around to see the hand a soldier had pointed at the sky and followed its direction. Izuku's eyes widened and a curse erupted from Master Fingus. Eternal and blue, Izuku couldn't believe that the sky could be painted black with so much smoke. "Gods, let us not be late," Izuku heard the Master of Arms say next to him as they galloped towards where the smoke mostly likely originated. There, they crested a rise where in each successive step they took, smoke blew through them in a screen. Izuku only say the grayness, eyes stinging and nose burning with the onslaught of dark smoke. Coughing can be heard from the distance, but the sounds seemed to come from all direction and at once. Izuku wished that he could see, that he could breathe properly once again as he slowed down and reached out a searching hand towards where he knew Master 𝗵𝗃 stopped. A cold hand gripped his, and for a moment Izuku was alarmed at such sensation before the smoke parted a little to see the strong man greeting him with a smile. Then, as if the gods themselves were helping them in their journey, a strong gust of cold wind blew over them, rich with the stink of burning wood, and parted the gloom before them, revealing to Izuku a sight that he had never seen before in all his life. The border town was different from what Izuku could imagine. It was far different from the town of Balame, with its great ports that overlooked the sea. The town had hugged the coast, building houses and roads where it was possible, and relied on the terrain for fortifications. Izumi's town was circular, with 2 walls encircling it. The second wall protected the town proper, encircling the majority of the houses and buildings. The first wall protected what seemed to be farmland, with a small scattering of large wooden building that Izuku knew could only be storehouses. In a time of peace, this town would have been perfect, ordered, and would move like clockwork, but it was burning. A great portion of the first wall that faced the west raged with tongues of flames. Most of the storehouses blazed as well, and had made the dark smoke that choked the blue of the sky. Izuku could see it in the distance, faintly but still, but it was in the sight of the small figures of men fighting a group of people on horseback, and failing to push them out of the wall that spurred Izuku and Master 𝗵𝗃 on, towards the town and its closed gates where, even from Izuku's distance, he could hear shouts and pleas of opening the great gates which remained tightly shut. 2 border guards stood manning the gate. One was focused on the people, his mouth opened and moving as if he was talking to the people below. But the other one, who kept her eyes on the east, opened her mouth and clutched at the busy soldier. The other soldier turned, his eyes and mouth going wide as the first, and turned to his back once again. A hush fell over the air, only to be replaced with the pounding of hooves on the now cobblestone-covered ground. "We come from the Baroness," Master 𝗵𝗃 shouted, raising his fist. "Tell me what has happened to the battle." "The plainsman has breached the first wall, my lord," the woman said. Her voice was clear and filled to the brim with fear, but she carried on nonetheless, telling them that the nomad raiders had entered through a weakened portion of the wall that hadn't been repaired during the winter through explosives. This alarmed Izuku. With explosives at hand, he feared that the battle would be lost. He knew the power behind those things, knew how much it would damage them, but the soldier had said that no other explosives had been used since the breaking of the wall. Master 𝗵𝗃 listened throughout, not interrupting the border guard as she recounted the tale of how, dazed from such a blast, the defenders of the first wall had been overwhelmed and had not enough time to mount a proper defense. "The raiders are small, my lord, 50 strong, but in the confusion they managed to turn the tide of the battle into their favor, and now they've managed to push the defenders so far from their posts," the soldier finished, each word coming out from her mouth more ragged than the first. From his position, Izuku could see her grip the lance she carried tightening. Her eyes were wide, glowing with hope. "But now you're here, my lord. Now, you're here. Rest assured, we'll see you all to safety," Master 𝗵𝗃 replied. He then turned to Izuku and the rest of the men he had with him. Eyes bright and burning, he told them of the course of action they were to take in the battle. Due to their advantage in numbers, 100 of the keep's forces were to ride towards the broken portion of the first wall and cut off the escape route of the raiders. He had also commanded the remaining border guards at the second wall to rally all those who can wield a bow and gather at the western part of the second wall, arrows nocked and ready. there to receive Master 𝗵𝗃𝗃's signal to release. "Those nomads would never know what hit them," said Master 𝗵𝗃 as he readied the 100 men. A grim smile was on his face as he did so, and Izuku hoped that their plan would work and retake the battle once again into their favor. Izuku watched as the 100 men under the leadership of Master 𝗵𝗃 galloped towards the direction of where the tier in the first wall was located. They would have to at least circle the wall, but Izuku knew they'd reach it in no time if they kept up with that kind of speed. He began counting up to 100, following Master 𝗵𝗃's orders, and readied his own unit of soldiers with him. Izuku had not liked being part of the soldiers in reserve. He wanted to be a part of Master 𝗵𝗃's own fighting force, to be a part of the fighting against the raiders who was well into their way in destroying the town, but the words of his mother had loomed above Master 𝗵𝗃 when he made the decision, and the promise he had made to her stopped any thought of disobeying from Izuku. He felt powerless to do anything with his position, but he knew the plan they had made was delicate as glass, and if he moved in his own accord against it, it would definitely break. And so Izuku counted to 100, willing himself to do it in a pace that was neither hurried nor sluggish. With impatience growing inside him, however, he knew it would be a hard task to keep in check, but he managed it. As soon as the last number left his mouth, he called to the men in a voice that he believed carried authority and might, and ordered them to follow the path Master 𝗵𝗃 had taken. The smoke limited Izuku's vision, only letting him see a few paces ahead. As such, he could only see things that appeared from the gloom before him, an occurrence that proved to be a hindrance to Izuku and his soldiers, as they kept watch on the road for any signs of traps or rubble that could hamper their approach. It delayed their progress significantly, but Izuku bit his lips and pushed on. He could hear it in the distance now, even with their sluggish movements. The sound of hooves pounding on the dirt and the shouts of Master 𝗵𝗃 as he told orders that floated in the cover of the smoke. Hugging close to the wall, Izuku called for his men to hasten. That order was carried through, and soon, cold sunlight illuminated Izuku's face as the smoke parted, revealing a vista of green plains as far as the eye can see. He had no time to admire the scenery, however, as he turned and spurred his mount on, seeing the line of horsemen at the distance with Master 𝗵𝗃 at the lead. The first wall loomed over them, and Izuku saw the aforementioned crack and realized that it was more larger than what he had imagined. Master 𝗵𝗃's men were steadily drawing towards it without so much as a resistance. Izuku took that as a sign of good faith and followed after them with his men. Blood was pounding inside his head, and his heart was ready to burst from his breast as the distance between the main attacking force and Izuku's reserves dwindled. At the back of his head, Izuku remembered that they had to keep a considerable distance away from them. He slowed down, calling for a halt, watching the 100-strong men close in on the large gap in the wall, when he saw a figure with sandy hair up in one end of the broken walls throw something dark at the gap, then ran. A sinking feeling twisted Izuku's guts as he realized what that was. He had read enough about them to know how they looked like as well. Master 𝗵𝗃 and his men were still a good distance away from that. Izuku spurred his horse onward, going after them, opening his mouth as a sound like 100 peals of thunder erupted along with a fountain of upended earth and stone ahead of Izuku. So loud was the sound that the horse Izuku was on was spooked beyond measure, rearing up and down in fright. Izuku held on to dear life, a metallic taste in his mouth as he realized he had bitten his tongue, but his mount had become too wild, too scared, that in a blink of an eye, the hold Izuku had on the reins, the world spun. Izuku thought that he had learned how to fly only to have his body crash to the rocky ground with a loud thud, arrows spilling all around him. A silence descended on the field where Izuku sprawled, a silence that Izuku thought was a haunting sound in his mind. He stood up, legs shaking and body sore, scooping a handful of arrows along the way, and shivered as he saw what had become of Master 𝗵𝗃's attack force. There had been 100 of them before, proud, powerful, and honorable men of Balame come to defend the overrun border town, But now amidst all the rubble and earth and dark smoke the force looked pitiful as some crumpled on the ground, while others that was further away from the explosion dealt with the chaos their horses created. Master Fingus was nowhere to be seen. Izuku couldn't believe it. One blast was all it took to reduce the once powerful men of 𝗵𝘃𝗵𝐴 into nothing but a writhing mass of chaos. Horror-filled Izuku gripped him with terribly strong hands, and he turned around at the sight, falling once again to the earth where he heaved what he had for lunch that day. They had failed. The town now was sure to be destroyed. Izuku knew that 50 more men wouldn't make a difference if the raiders still had more explosives with them. The real hope now were the combined might of the garrisons Master Fingus had contacted earlier, but that hope was rapidly dwindling as time passed. Smoke filled Izuku's head as he continued to retch. That smoke parted and revealed the image he had made before, during their journey. An image that slowly turned into reality. "I'm sorry, Izumi. Failed you," Izuku said through gritted teeth. He wanted to scream, to shout at the raiders and exact to them vengeance Izuku knew he was capable of. But his body was tired, bruised, and beaten. He could only choke on his sobs as tears flowed freely from his face. The sound of boots crunching against the gravel brought Izuku awareness that someone was coming to him. He raised his head, his eyes still shedding tears, and caught sight of one of his knights drawing near him, the rein on Izuku's horse in his hands. "My lord," he said, his voice grave yet solemn. He handed the reins to Izuku, who took it and stood up with his help as well. Eyeing the knight, Izuku was certain that he was of the same age as him. The knight sighed and looked at the place where the men of the main attacking force were slowly coming to terms. Izuku watched as well as they stood from the ground, in ones or by two holding each other up. Breath caught itself inside Izuku's throat as he saw two men supporting the bloody visage of Master Fingus. Alive. He was still alive. Bloody, but alive. "We need to help them," Izuku finally said, pushing down the lump that had been there for quite some time. He turned to the young knight and gave him the order. Orders were passed and soon they were heading towards the injured, ready to defend them should the nomads return and attack. Izuku resolved to hold the position of guarding the gap, if it meant gaining time for the injured soldiers to 𝗵𝗃𝗃 retreat. The other soldiers seemed to share the sentiment as they nodded and said their agreements. But before they could set their plans into actions, Izuku heard a series of hooting coming from the other side of the wall. It was the only warning he knew as horses bearing the forms of men and women burst from the gap, thankfully avoiding the injured soldiers, but encircling them as well. "No," Izuku shouted, seeing it all unfold. They were so close, so near to Master Fingus and his men, but the appearance of the nomadic raiders cut them off from each as quickly as that. Their bows were nocked and were ready to be released, aimed at the soldiers who cowered and glared before them. A new group of nomads came out of the gap. Izuku noticed that this group flocked around a figure sitting on horseback that had their form covered in a brown cloak. Squinting, Izuku could make out the bruised features of a woman of his age, pink hair matted with blood as she stared at her hands with determined hands. Izuku's attention shifted to the group surrounding her. Almost all of them had faces that either showed anger or disgusts, aimed at Master Fingus and the battered soldiers. One, however, a woman with blonde hair and golden eyes, had her face twisted with a look of delight that showed her canines. At that instant, Izuku knew that that woman spelled trouble. "So many blood bags to tear," the woman said. Panic surged inside Izuku, and he hastened to knock an arrow. The woman had brandished a wicked-looking blade as she said those words, and her golden eyes were trained on the injured men carrying with it a light that was all too lucid to be called sanity. Before Izuku could draw, however, a rather rough voice tore through the tense atmosphere that had begun forming around them. "Stop that, you crazy bitch. We got what we came for, and now we need to go." You're no fun at all when we're doing raids," the woman replied, her face a picture of sadness. Izuku's eyes were trained on the person who the golden-eyed woman was talking to. Seeing the darkening scowl on his face made Izuku remember something in the murky depths of his mind. The person's blood-red eyes were alight with irritation as his mouth began to open, the furs on his red cloak and sandy hair bristling on the wind. The scent of sulfur was thick in air. If the men hadn't been hit by that blast, they could have defeated the nomads by now, and none of this would have happened. Something in his memory clicked. Izuku found himself staring once again at the scene before the blast. A single form was up on the walls, and had thrown the explosive that had broken their might. "You," Izuku hissed. A surge of hatred filled his being. Red. All Izuku could see was red as he pulled the bowstring taut with shaking hands. This man was the cause of this. This man was the one who wounded the keep's soldiers, who almost killed his teacher. Izuku's whole being shook. Tears fell rapidly from his eyes, and he screamed, a scream so loud that it caught the man's attention. "I'll kill you," he screamed, his voice breaking. A heartbeat was all it would take for Izuku to fire, Izuku knew. Suddenly, Izuku's mind flashed a memory 8 years ago, when he first learned how to use the bow and arrow, of the dummy that he had missed. He had been afraid to hit it, thinking that if he did, he'd be essentially killing a person instead. Izuku knew this man was no dummy. Even as he had a tense expression on his face, his blood-red eyes alight with fury, Izuku knew that his man would bleed, could die with an arrow stuck between those furrowed brows. Could he do it? Izuku took a deep breath and faltered. Staggering back, all he could hear was the alarmed voices of his knights as they swarmed around him, encircling him with a wall of their armor and flesh. Pain, so bright, so searing, pounded on the joint where Izuku's left shoulder was, and he screamed, a hoarse sound that seemed to pull out his throat every time he breathed. "It's going to be okay, my lord," a soothing voice said. Izuku faintly realized that it came from the night before. "I got you," the knight's voice continued, assuring him through the throbbing pain. Izuku clenched his teeth as he fought to stand. Each shift of his muscles brought a new burst of agony. But he managed the feat and regarded the nomadic raider before him. "Oi, you fucker 𝐈𝐺. I told you that the little shit won't do it. Why'd you hit him?" The young man called, tilting his head towards another young man who had brilliant red hair. The man called 𝐈𝐺 snapped his head towards the one who called him, the bow in his hands seemingly forgotten. The young man called 𝐈𝐺 raised both of his hands, a bewildered expression on his face. "I didn't know that. He could have killed you, Katsuki. The look on his face says it." Yeah, but he didn't. "And now look at what you'd done to the little princess," he said with a smirk, his amused gaze returning to Izuku, who returned the gaze with one of his own. An excited smile blossomed on the one the man had called Katsuki. "Well, hello there, you little piece of noble shit. Would you kindly order those big idiots of yours to stop blocking our exit? We promise not to hurt you or you soldiers as long as they don't hurt us as well, or would you rather have this instead?" From the confines of his cloak, Izuku saw the one called Katsuki draw out a small, black object and brandished it at him. Izuku sucked in a breath, remembering the sounds, the feeling of an explosion. He stared at Katsuki, horrified. "You wouldn't dare," he said. "Wouldn't I?" Katsuki replied, tightening his grip on the explosive on his hands. "Try me, you little shit." Izuku took deep breaths, considering his position. The enemy had yet another explosive in possession, with an owner that had seemingly come to terms with madness. Master Finga's forces crushed, the morale of the 50 reserves severely lowered, and most of all, they were surrounded by long-ranged fighters. Izuku knew to wage a battle against them would mean a loss. Izuku continued to hold Katsuki's stare, however, but all it did was make the other person's smile more sinister. The answer was clear. Nodding, Izuku said, "Go, and never return."